Testing, testing.
Is it on? Okay, sorry. All right, sorry for the delay. We are on to item number 5, the current hydrologic conditions. I know it's about to rain today, so that's sort of memorable for your presentation. Mine said showers. It was raining in the Bay Area, and it said showers for Sacramento, but it's sunny now. Okay.
Good morning, board members and the public. My name is Vadim Demchuk, and with me today is Alessia Sikleri. We're both engineers with the Division of Water Rights, and we're here to present the hydrology update for the Bay Delta watershed, item number 5. I would like to wish everyone a happy new water year as well.
Thank you.
And I would like to start off with just recapping what happened the previous water year. For Northern Sierra, we landed at 40.9 inches, 79% of average for this date, just right above the 2014-2015 red line. For the Central Sierra, we're at 19 inches, 74% of average for this date. And for the Southern Sierra, 62% of average for the date, 17.9 inches. I would also like to show another figure here from West Wide Drought Tracker. Essentially, we're seeing here October through August precipitation for a 2018 water year, and the ranking is going back to 1895. And so in terms of percentages in terms of precipitation, the southern part of California is at the bottom 10 percentile on the drier side of things. Central and Northern California, near normal in some areas, a bit above normal in other areas. And then we have northwestern California staying pretty dry. Here's a look at our regional water supply. Here are the major reservoirs in our region. For the most part, all of these are hovering about average. Some are slightly above average. Some are slightly below and above. And another takeaway from this is we're a bit lower than we were last time, the same time last year, and that's because of the great precipitation that we had the previous year. So just to make a note of that. Kachuma Reservoir, 30% of capacity and 41% of average. Diamond Valley Lake, 87% of capacity. San Luis Reservoir, 54% of capacity and 118% of average. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor as of September 25th, 2018. Severe drought is depicted in Southern California, D3 extreme drought as well. And we also see severe drought creeping into Northern California, and that's due to the warmer temperatures and the low snowpack that we had this season. A look at our short-term outlook. There's a split between higher odds of warmer than normal temperatures for the western part and going either way for the eastern part of the state. And then for precipitation for Northern California, below average precip, and for Southern California, above average precip. And everyone's probably thinking about the El Nino Southern Oscillation condition. So in terms of the ENSO condition, this is the recent update from the Climate Prediction Center. On the map on the lower left, we are seeing different Nino regions. If you look at the yellow and the red for Nino 4, 3.4, and 3, we've been warming up since October, and you can see that on the right-hand side of things. But the interesting thing to note here is Nino 1 and 2, which is still below average, and this is a big deal. If we transition to an El Nino, the exact location does matter. So typically, if we have warmer conditions for Nino 1 and 2, that typically leads to stronger winters for West Coast California and into Nevada. But if it remains cool, really it's more uncertain how El Nino plays out. And especially if it continues warm and shifting more towards Nino 4 and 3.4, we really don't have much of an indicator whether we will receive more precipitation or not in Northern California.
So I'm sorry, but I'm a little bit remedial on this. Could you start with a little more basic facts on how to read this?
So again, the lower left is just the location of the Nino, the warming of the ocean on the lower left. And so for Nino 4 and 3.4, it's warming a lot more than it is closer to the coast, which is in white. And so the big takeaway from this is, well, you know, the impact that we have in Northern California really relies more on Nino 1 and 2. And so we're still waiting for that to change. And so if that Nino 1 and 2, that white little box there, if it changes to a yellow and red, then we could potentially have a wetter winter. But that's still kind of, we're still waiting for an update.
Does 3 and 4, does the whole thing move, or does 3 and 4 mean it's likely to be wetter somewhere else, or nothing at all?
I'm not sure. I think it's locked. That location is locked.
Okay.
Where we're looking for Nino 3 and 4.
Well, and we know Australia is having a very dry period.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder for everyone, not all El Ninos are the same. Mm-hmm. And we have to keep an eye on how it develops this year if something does develop this year.
Well, we know we spent a lot of time on El Nino predictions during the drought that amounted to nothing, but it still merits watching and following Daniel Swain and all of his utterances. So,
Here's a look at all our past El Nino events, weak, moderate, and strong. We had 23 historical El Nino seasons since we started keeping a record. As you can see, it's really all over the board, but the strongest signal historically for a wet season has been in Southern California typically. But again, this is not always the case. As we know, in 2015-16, El Nino season, Southern California didn't receive as much rain as we did in Northern California. Northern California has equal chances, really. It could go either way, wet conditions, normal conditions, and dry conditions. A weak El Nino is forecasted for this fall and winter season, but again, this does not guarantee a wet winter. So we'll see how it plays out. This concludes our portion of the brief, and we are here to answer any questions board members may have.
Any questions, suggestions?
Yeah, just a minor little suggestion for the next update. Moving to the slide, probably about slide 3 or 4 on precipitation in the Southern Sierra, and seeing the difference. If you could go back.
Sure. Let's go back.
Yeah, right there. So it just made me think about Lake Isabella, that project, and how they're undergoing dam safety. As I recall, they just haven't been able to utilize the capacity of that reservoir because of dam safety issues. So that might be interesting to get an update on the status of the repairs, and then also the percent of capacity currently at Lake Isabella.
Great.
Good idea. Anything else? No, just thank you. Important to stay on it and appreciate it. And appreciate you changing it up a little bit. Learn something new each time. All right, that takes us to item number 6, a perennial favorite, the update on water conservation.
Good morning, board members.
Morning.
Seems so far away.
Very.
This is informational item number 6, urban water conservation results for the month of August 2018. And the headline here is that the production was 12.6% below the production in 2013. And the remaining few slides really summarize some of the other key results. This chart shows statewide urban water production, and the blue shaded area is the urban water production for all 409 urban water suppliers reported for 2013. And a reminder that throughout the year, from January through December, there is this pattern in water use where it peaks really in July and August. The dark blue line shows our preliminary urban water production results for 2018. Preliminary because reporting has been voluntary, and so we have pretty good participation, but we don't have complete 409 urban water supplier reports. So the dashed blue line shows an estimate of what the complete record might look like. It's a conservative estimate based on the reports for the previous year, so 2017 water production for those that didn't report in 2018. We just kind of plugged in those numbers to get an idea of what that production might look like, and the white line shows the urban water production for 2017. So what I want to point out that based on the 355 reports we received for August 2018, the urban water production, the preliminary number would be 188.2 billion gallons, so that's the solid line, and it looks like it's falling compared to July, but if we add those estimated missing reports, we see that we're kind of not really decreasing the urban water production. It's slightly above what was last year in August. Okay. And so when we report the percent savings, a reminder that we do that comparing only to the baseline for the 355 that reported in August of this year. So we're not those 355 suppliers saved 12.6%. We had about 87% of all suppliers submit a report for August 2018. This board meeting is early in October, so we did download the data a few days earlier than we would for a different board schedule. So the participation is a little bit lower than previous months. 54 suppliers did not submit by the time we downloaded the data. And the blue slices of the chart show that more than 3/4 of all suppliers that reported for August, of all suppliers actually reported some level of savings, and more than half savings above 10%.
When the reporting was mandatory, what were our no reports looking like?
Probably within a couple of percentage points of non-reporters, so it would range across months, but maybe 2, 3, 4%.
Okay.
And we had also enforcement tied to non-reporting, so then those reports would fill in the following month or following couple of months.
And what's the timeline again when it comes to the efficiency legislation and mandatory reporting, once again, being part of our authorities?
Right. The water efficiency legislation authorized development of permanent reporting regulation, and staff are working on that. So we plan to bring that to you in the next few months, and we expect it would become effective in 2019. No specific timeline yet, but when that's ready.
Along the same line, I'm curious, has the number of suppliers not reporting increased, decreased over time? Is there any sort of a trend?
There is a trend that is showing a decrease in voluntary reporting. So we do have those that don't report occasionally, then they catch up on their reports. But overall, those that don't report has been slowly increasing over time. The reports do fill in over time, so we shared with you some summaries of those trends that initial non-reporters, what would be depicted by the orange slice on this pie chart, is usually much higher than in the next month or two, the August reports might fill in.
Yeah, it usually comes, I think if I recall correctly, back down to about 18 or 19, just non-reporters, but solid sort of non-reporters. I only bring up the issues because, these data, this information is really critical when it comes to, how we as a state manage our resources. But I know there was some sort of grumblings, if you will, from some of the urban water agencies about the reporting, what data they were reporting, how they were reporting it. So to the extent that, us moving to voluntary and now seeing such a large number of suppliers just kind of forego sort of the reporting, I'd like to make sure we're engaging them and seeing, how is it that we can make it easier, or what is it that they feel. I know sometimes it's simply a staffing issue as well, so it's not to say that it's somehow a desire to not provide the data or the information, but looking forward to the development of the regs and that discussion with the urban water agencies around what they feel is the best data set to be reporting. How do we get the most out of this information so that it can be a useful tool? Because when we look at the percentage at this point pegged to 2013, having such a significant number of non-reporters really kind of makes the data a little not as useful as it could be otherwise. So, thank you.
So
Yeah,
it's just,
Oh, go ahead.
I think those are good questions. Oh, go ahead, if you were going to
well,
respond.
just a couple thoughts. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, it's impossible to tell who's talking.
Yeah. To Board Member Escobar's point about the difficulty with the reporting, I will say for the conservation reporting, it's very, we went to a lot of lengths to make it simple, and I don't think the time it takes to report for the vast majority of suppliers is a major issue. It is still time, but it's fairly straightforward, and I think
I was giving them the benefit of the doubt.
easy to do. Jonathan Bishop just asked if for future updates we could put a slide that shows sort of a trend of reporting. I think that's a good idea, and I think that would get at some of the questions that are coming up here.
And that slide has been provided before. Previous updates, I do recall the sort of, over time, sort of the percentage that actually are non-reporting. Because we do, I mean, when the numbers first, the reports first hit, yeah, there is a large chunk, but it does get whittled down quite significantly. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, agree. And did you, Yelena, did we have that slide with the trend?
We don't have it today, but we will bring it back. We have been including it in some of the briefing material, and I think it's a good idea to bring it back as a slide during the presentation of the item.
That's right. And periodically, we've looked at who's reporting and who's not. It tends to be smaller ones, although there's some larger ones.
So my question is related to just any suggestions on, how to incentivize this. So for those that, I agree with you, Mr. Oppenheimer, that you've already simplified it quite a bit. So it's probably unlikely that the challenge is that just that it takes too much time. It's probably the smaller entities that are just, having management challenges overall. But anything that can be done to incentivize even late reporting or quarterly reporting where they put it in as a batch. And then just thinking for the future on the development of the permanent reg and anything that could be included to go back and pick up on these prior reports, because to the extent that this information, would be useful, over a period of time, it's a shame to have such a gap.
It would be great to fill in the gaps once the reporting becomes mandatory with the regulation. You are correct, though, that these are smaller suppliers, and although anecdotally we do know that it takes not that much of a time, for some it's a burden that they've reported. They just prioritized below other things that they're working on. Others have told us that it's not mandatory. They will come back once it's mandatory, so it's just their choice. And the 13% of suppliers that didn't report for August 2018 represent about 7.5% of the population. So that tells us that a large number, but smaller population, that those are smaller suppliers. So we do hope to fill in the gaps, though. This is a valuable data set. The measure that shows residential gallons per person per day is easy to relate to. So this slide really shows this residential use for August of each of the past years since 2013. And statewide residential use was 116 gallons per person per day this August, this year. And we see that it's similar to the past couple of years. So it's a gallon or two below or above 2016 and 2017, but well below 2013. So we do see that that attitude and the conservation habits have stuck. And this metric is also meaningful because it normalizes the water use by the population. So it gets around a little bit that issue of incomplete reports. And the final thought that we wanted to share with you today is, again, a reminder and kudos to the communities that have extremely low residential use. For August 2018, 15 communities had their total residential use at or below 55 gallons per person per day. This list is sorted in descending order from largest to the smallest supplier, and so we see that there's a range. Both large communities and smaller ones have achieved this type of water use. Clearly, it's related to other factors. It's not just conservation attitude, but we do know it's possible, and 55 is a benchmark that is set to be the indoor water use standard. So
yeah, so they're using 55 indoor and out, and knowing those communities, it's not that they're without outdoor landscaping primarily, even San Francisco.
So that completes the item for today, unless there are any additional questions.
No, that's great. Thank you very, very much. Glad to see it holding. All right. Do we want to take a break before item number 7 or plow right ahead? Plow right ahead. Here we go. Item number 7. The ELAP update, yes, thank you. This is a sobering presentation.
All right, thank you, and good morning. Chair Marcus, fellow board members, I'm Christine Sotelo, and I'm the program manager for California ELAP. And what we have for you today is a panel of perspectives on the progress of California ELAP. To my left here, they're sitting where I didn't think they would sit. To my left here is Mitzi Miller. She is the Vice President of Environmental Programs for NV5 Dade Moeller. She is executing the training contract that you all approved a couple of years ago, and so she'll give you a report out. To my right is Bruce LaBelle. He is a member of the executive branch of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and he is the spokesperson for the state regulatory agencies that use ELAP accredited labs to make those environmental and public health decisions. And to the far left over there is Stephen Clark, who is the Vice President of Pacific Icarus Laboratories, and he is the chair of the Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee, and he'll give you his perspective. And all the way to the very end is Kim Niemeyer, who is our attorney and counsel for California ELAP. All right, so I will tee up this panel. With my presentation. All right. So, we are a program that's been implementing reforms in earnest and trying to turn the program around. The program that we inherited that had a lot of problems. And you can see the list here on the screen of all of the problems that we have been addressing. But you as the board have invested in us and supported us to try and turn the program around. We are not quite there yet. We still have some work to do. So my first presentation for you today is to talk to you about what we've accomplished since we've moved over here from the Department of Public Health. And so the one thing, though, that I'd like to note is that as we make progress, we're in a better position to understand how the laboratories are now doing. And so my second presentation for you will focus on that and some ideas that we want to share with you on how to help get past those issues with the laboratories and the findings that we're seeing. So what have we done since you've seen us last? It's been a couple of years, and really what we're doing is we're trying to ensure that we have the best program and improve it. And so these are the areas that I want to talk to you about today. So first, you know, we talk a lot about a quality management system and its policies and procedures that any organization should be putting in place so that they have quality. And, you know, as much as we've been asking the laboratories to document their quality management system, we are too. We are implementing an internal management system. We have a quality assurance officer whose eye is only on quality. And we've developed several more SOPs since you saw us last. We have revised our quality assurance manual, which is the overall manual to ensure that our program is following processes of quality. And then every year since US EPA has audited us, the audits have gotten better and better. So we are definitely improving in that area. The one key thing about this, it's all about continuous improvement. We're not going to be perfect. We're going to have complaints, but what you do with those complaints is you find the areas of improvement, and then you update an SOP, you update a quality assurance manual. So that's the philosophy behind a quality management system. The next thing that you've heard a lot is that ELAP was not communicating. They weren't communicating with the laboratories they accredit and with the stakeholders. So we've done a lot, as you can see in this list, to help open the lines of communication with all of our laboratories. One really big step that we've made is from application to accreditation. When they get their certificate, we've been communicating with the labs every step of the way, what they need, what they're missing, because the goal is to accredit the lab if they pass the regulations and the law, and we're communicating with them all along the way. The next thing you know is obviously the bad communication that we have all heard about with our Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee. You know that we invigorated it, we put new members. They've met a lot of times, a dozen times, and you'll hear more from Stephen Clark on his perspective on the work that we've been doing with them and the activities we've been engaging with them in. But we now have a relationship. Before there was none. They would recommend something to ELAP and ELAP wouldn't respond. And we have a good line of communication with them, providing advice to us. The next is we have now a relationship with our state agency partners, those agencies that use ELAP accredited data. And Bruce LaBelle will give you his perspective. We've met just as many times with our agency partners. And as I've said before, they drive our program and they tell us what their needs are, which is what we structure our program around. And then we are reaching out with all the other agencies, and we're becoming more of a bridge too to their laboratory needs. We've successfully put together 4 work groups on lab capacity. One perfect example is the recent adoption of the pyrethroid basin plan amendment in the Central Valley Water Board. They're looking for a method to go down to a lower detection level, and so we're bridging together the laboratory experts with the Region 5 to find a method that's validated and can meet their intended use. And so we're now becoming the bridge between the agencies and their needs in the labs. So if you remember, everyone at ELAP did everything, and there were no SOPs. So what we did was we restructured the program. We had made specialized unit to ensure that all of the staff in ELAP are complying with our responsibility in the laws and in the regulations. So we created a PT unit. We've got dedicated staff to look at thousands of lines of data to ensure that we are accrediting in a lab if they pass their PT, if they submit the right one, if they report. So we're looking at that. We even created an enforcement unit that hasn't been ever existed before. There's 3 dedicated staff to respond to any referrals from the agency partners, and they're keeping busy. I'll talk to you more about the data for both PT unit and enforcement unit in my later presentation at the end of the panel. And then we have now a dedicated on-site assessment unit. They're the fact finders. That's all they do. They don't review an application. They don't accept a check for a fee. That is the only thing that they're responsible for, and which is a good lead-in to kind of the training that we're having for these specialized units. All of them are now focused on what they are charged with doing. The regulation staff are learning more about regulations. Enforcement staff have gotten very comprehensive enforcement action training and fraud training. And with assessor training, we really wanted them to be the best. If you remember, we wanted it to be the best assessor program in any accrediting body in the nation. And here it is, as a reminder. It was executed, and you'll hear more about it from Mitzi. You invested in us, and it's delivering everything that we wanted. We're getting the training, technical training that the staff need, and we're also getting out of our drinking backlog that you heard about. And so it's providing us exactly what we asked for. So that's what we've accomplished, and we still have a lot more to go. So I want to talk to you about what else we need to do to help move the program forward and continue to improve. We need to adopt the regulations. You heard from us at a workshop. We proposed to you what we would like to incorporate by reference and all of the issues and the problems that we have with our current regulations. We're ready to release a next draft to the public, and then you will be seeing a package for your consideration in early 2019. But as you know, there are some concerns about adopting TNI and incorporating it into reference into our regulations, and we're still very committed to our time, tools, and training initiative that we want to help labs succeed. So underway, we have the public workshops that have already happened last year. In fact, part of the contract for NV5 Dade Moeller was to provide TNI workshops for the laboratory community, and they did that last year, 4 throughout the state, to talk about the standard. They're also providing complementary gap analysis in laboratories that they assess. So these are the drinking water labs. So not only are my staff getting trained, we're getting out of our backlog, but they're looking at the laboratories and saying, what do you need to comply with TNI? You're missing this, you're missing that. It's not a detailed analysis, it's a broad gap analysis, but at least it's a roadmap for the laboratories to kind of get started and understand where they need to be. And we're also getting help from the industry. You know, in the next CWEA conference in 2019, there's a set of TNI training classes to help laboratories understand and ask questions about TNI. The American Council of Independent Laboratories, ACIL, has offered to mentor labs in California that are not implementing TNI to help them understand, ask questions. And I'm going to propose at the next LTAC meeting that we talk about how LTAC can contribute into helping and giving some ideas on how to help laboratories comply. We still have that documentation workshop that we talked about, where it's going to be multiple workshops throughout California where laboratories can walk in and walk out and hopefully have the tools that they need, like a quality assurance manual, an SOP for maybe some simple methods that they can leave and be successful with in implementing TNI. And then the time commitment, we're still proposing an extended implementation time for adoption of TNI if it is in the regulations by reference. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and we can move on to the next speakers if you like.
Thank you. I'm Mitzi Miller with Dade Moeller, a wholly owned subsidiary of NV5. My team of people have been supporting laboratory auditing since 2000, and actually before that, but 2000 is when the TNI came to bear and started using third-party assessors. The presentation today is going to talk about team qualifications, the purpose of our contract and the status of it, findings from the assessment, which I think is most interesting, and some observations that all of our assessors had made. When we put together a team to support your contract, we have a team that has about 325 years of assessment experience. We tried to go and find people who were truly experts in the various subsets of each aspect of your contract. Marlene Moore has trained hundreds of environmental assessors. She's the primary trainer for the TNI. She has trained almost every state assessor in the United States. She also trains for a number of other ISO accrediting organizations that are based on the same quality system that you use in TNI. So she has an extensive training background. We have 10 staff that have audited over 30 labs per year. In fact, most of us audit 20 to 40 labs a year. Our technical expertise includes auditing outside environmental, FDA, USDA, USGS. So we try to take the knowledge we learn from other organizations and implement it within the environmental arena. Those names with an asterisk are our auditors and our assessors. They've been all around California performing assessments over the time period, and a lot of the information in these slides comes from their audits. The purpose of the contract was to provide training, assist in developing requirements, and assess drinking water labs. As of September 30, 2018, we had provided 7 courses, and it's not just the course material and curriculum, but we've also, within those courses, taught the assessors how to review data packages for all types of methods. We've taught them how to review SOPs. We've given them mock audits. We've taught communication. We've taught skills in questioning, so that the assessors have the tools to go out and actually perform assessments. We've also done 2 specific assessor training classes. Marlene is focused on those, providing how you orchestrate an audit, how you do a pre-assessment before you get there, providing a lot of the details that an assessor needs in order to implement auditing. And as Christine already pointed out, we've done the multiple one-day public workshops to explain the 2016 TNI across the state. We assisted Christine's staff by reviewing their operational procedures, their PT procedures. Mr. Richard Shibley, who was formerly the person who implemented TNI for the state of Pennsylvania, is on our team. He was the focus because he has sat in the chair that Christine sits in terms of implementing it in a state that had never had TNI before. So we felt like he was a good person to help review a lot of those procedures. We generated a lot of checklists for your staff to use. There are some issues with that in the fact that we have so many different versions of any given test being used that it's hard to actually set up one set of checklists. When any method may have 5 different versions floating out there and standard methods, it becomes a bit of a challenge. We advise Christine's staff on the laboratory requirements. We've developed some on-site assessment observation forms. Those are things so that Christine can use those to evaluate her assessors. And we use it to evaluate our own assessors. But it's a tool for evaluating how well people are performing audits. We've assessed a lot of the California drinking water labs. To date, we've completed 88. We have another 20 scheduled before the end of December. We do the reports. We submit the corrective action plans and review, well, the labs submit the corrective action plans to us. We review those. We make recommendations to Christine and her team. 13 labs have either dropped or canceled out of the program. We've are planning to audit 320 labs by the end of 3 years, and by the end of the calendar year, we hope to have completed about 1/3 of them. Now, one point I would make is that Christine's assessors come with us on audits as part of their mentoring. To date, they have followed us on almost all of our audits, at least one person or another. We will begin the process in the coming calendar year for her assessors to perform the audits while we watch them. So it's a observe, learn, get the technical knowledge, and then begin to do it yourself. Deficiencies from assessments. If you look at the data from the first 68 assessments. That's 21% of the drinking water labs. Now, we believe this is a representative sampling of all the labs. And why would that be? Because the same basic methods are used in drinking water and non-potable water. And many of those are also used in solid waste, but the preponderance is the same between drinking water and non-potable. So we believe that what we're seeing here will be reflective of what we see in the rest of the population. A deficiency is a failure to comply with the regulation or the published method. It is not a positive, it is a negative. And if you look at the graph, you'll see we have grouped the deficiencies 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, and above 20. And then you can see the number of labs on the left side of the chart. So basically, when you move into the higher number of deficiencies, it would lead one to believe that there is potentially some competency issues. We even have labs that have reached 70 findings in one laboratory. And I don't have to tell you that once you reach 70, you just basically have to stop and regroup.
Can you give a description of what that lab was? Not naming obviously the specific lab, but was it a small facility within a wastewater?
It was a medium-sized municipal lab.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, the severity of deficiencies. Labs with a large number of deficiencies include that we believe are more severe are those that have to do with methods, equipment, and we've divided it into method deviations, which includes things like not performing QC, not analyzing quality control in the manner that's prescribed by the published method. The next grouping is about 34% of labs that do not calibrate or verify calibration. Well, without calibration, I can't tell if your number is a valid number. Some folks have said, oh, there are no problems in performing the methods, but these statistics to me would say otherwise, because these are the foundation. This is the method that they have been running over the time period they have been accredited. And when you have multiple significant deficiencies, it indicates that a lab is not meeting minimum competency levels. And the method items are not new to the laboratories. These are not brand new methods that have been promulgated. There's nothing new about what's going on in most of these methods. We gave you some examples of deficiencies. We've divided them into those that we believe are significant and those that we think are much more serious. By no means this list is not exhaustive. It's simply some examples for you to consider. The first one is no lab director, no one in charge, and no notice to ELAP. So how would we know who's responsible for the testing? Using a lab information management system that has many incorrect calibration and quality control limits. And when you automate something, you tend to use that to spit out your reports to tell you what's good, what's bad. If the LIMS is incorrect, chances are your data will not be very supportable. Incorrect calculations, no method blanks, no duplicates, failing quality control, using expired media and standards. All of those things are significant issues in our mind. More serious, analyzing cyanide and having no idea how to calibrate your equipment. So how do you know if your cyanide results are correct or not? We have one lab that their floor is gravel. They're analyzing metals, and as you know, you have minerals coming out of gravel. You have a lot of contaminants that would be in a typical metals list. They have chosen to leave their lab basically being a floor of gravel. We have micro rooms that have not been disinfected in a long time. So how do you know? Insufficient volume being used for micro-testing. That means you might be getting false negatives because if you don't take a large enough sample, you may not represent what you're sampling. Published methods have options in the tests. The lab has no idea what option they're using. They manipulate PT results. Now, how do they do that? They run it 4 or 5 times where they run a sample one time. They run extra QC to go alongside it to adjust the results. They might communicate with other labs performing PTs.
There are a host of issues related to that, and it's very disconcerting that a lab doesn't believe their own numbers, so therefore they have to go to all these options to try to pass their PT.
Quick clarification, when you say micro, do you mean microbiological?
Microbiology,
So
biological. E. coli, fecal coliform, total coliform.
pathogen indicators that could be easily contaminated by quote-unquote dirty laboratory conditions.
Yes.
And then I had a question, no method blanks. What does that mean?
That means normally when you process a sample, you have a blank water that is treated the exact same way, but it's a distilled, deionized water from the laboratory. So the laboratory processes along with the samples to see if they contaminate the sample. All the methods in the regulations require that. Drinking water is particularly strict on it because you're measuring lower levels. You want to know if you're adding anything when you process the sample. So if you have no blanks, you don't know if you're adding contamination by the way you're handling the sample or not. Now, how pervasive are these deficiencies? Well, Christine's staff were really instrumental in generating a lot of taking our findings and deficiencies and generating a lot of this information. And I went through it, and I agree with what they've found. Basically, the problems don't change based on the size or the type of the laboratory. They looked at it from large and small, complex and simple testing, commercial and municipal. And I would say the labs in California are certainly trailing the national average in terms of deficiencies. We see a typical lab will have anywhere from 10 to 20, and that decreases over time after they implement quality systems and after they are audited a couple of series of times. So some more options on the deficiencies, or more discussion on the deficiencies. The quality assurance deficiencies make up about 25 to 26% of all the deficiencies. Now, that's a quality program similar to the one that Christine has implemented for her own staff. It's having manuals, training, QA, monitoring, doing your own internal audit so you know how you're doing, and fixing your problems before the data goes out the door. We have identified that small labs have 3 times more QA-related deficiencies than the other lab subgroups. And what this means is they don't have systems. So they don't know when a new method arrives, here's the system we use to implement a new method. Without systems, the deficiencies will not be corrected. Now, I can tell you this because we also audit for 5 other states, Florida being one of them. Florida implemented third-party a few years back. When we first went into Florida, they had not had consistent audits, much as California had not had in the past. What we saw is a lot of repeat findings, over and over again, the same finding in the same laboratory. We have now made a conscious effort to more closely audit quality systems. Florida did a lot of training on systems, and now we see many fewer repeat findings. So a few observations. First, I think the culture has to change. Small labs right now don't know how to deal with audits. They won't send us records ahead of time or documents ahead of time, so we have to do more work on site. And the second item there, some labs believe they should be audited into compliance. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take an example. If you're filling out your taxes every year, if you waited until the IRS audited you, would that be a good thing? No. These labs know the methods, they know the rules of the road, they need to learn the methods and how to implement them. They shouldn't expect somebody from the state of California to come and tell them every detail of that method because they're held accountable to do those methods. Labs have a dread and a fear about meeting requirements. And the interesting thing is at the end of almost every one of our audits, when we've explained and sat with those people, given them some ideas, talked to them about how they could implement certain things, they go, well, this wasn't so bad. And that's a good thing. That means they're gaining some knowledge, they're getting less fearful, and it means that when people are less fearful, they're more likely to implement. labs don't know how to set up processes. This goes back to the previous slide. You know the old adage, if you want to feed somebody, you can hand them a fish or you can teach them to fish. Well, it's much better to set up processes because that teaches them how to implement long-term. I will say that most of the labs want to comply. We've had a fairly small number that just didn't want to comply. But there are a lot of labs that never get out of their own home turf. They have no idea that any of these changes are in the offing to occur in regulation or anything, even with all the training. So that's still a consideration. Thank you. And if you have questions, I will be glad to entertain them.
Thank you. That's what I meant by a sobering presentation, but I appreciate the candor and the specificity with which you presented it. Are there questions before we move to the next? Well, we can obviously come back. Okay, because we have a number of speakers as well, so we'll want you to stay around. Thank you very much.
Advancing. Oh, okay. Well, as a quick introduction, Chair Marcus, board members, as Christine indicated, my name is Stephen Clark. I'm the Vice President of Pacific Eco Risk and also the chairperson of the Environmental Lab Technical Advisory Committee. Per the bylaws of the LTAC, also known as LTAC, I have an obligation on an annual basis to provide you with an update of the activities of LTAC. So what I'm going to be doing today is focusing on three things. One is to provide you a little bit of context from our bylaws in terms of what we're supposed to be doing. Second is to acknowledge the group of parties that are participants in LTAC, and then to move through the activities we've had in the last three meetings for which I was chair. So there's a couple of elements within our bylaws that really focus on the health and safety code. Primarily, the role of LTAC is to assist, advise, and make recommendations on technical, scientific, and administrative matters to ELAP. And that can be pretty diverse in terms of the framework on the topics that we're touching on. And so I'll go ahead and cover some of those in the last few slides as well. And the important thing is we also want to make sure that we're giving feedback on items that ELAP is dealing with that can impact the laboratory community and laboratory activities. The committee functions as a means of exchanging information. Much like your board, we have public comments. We engage the public in terms of information that they want to bring to bear. And a recent change in how our meetings are being held, we also started as we went through each agenda item and gave the public an opportunity to comment as well, so that we didn't kind of have an upfront loading of information and then kind of trying to make sure we were recalling what activities or what information was brought to bear by the public. And when I say the public, I primarily mean the laboratory community. Also, LTAC is supposed to assist ELAP in developing scientifically rigorous recommendations regarding issues that impact the laboratory community and regulatory agencies and data users. I'm going to touch on some of those. I think those have been pretty important outcomes and additional effort that the LTAC members have put forth. Improving communications and outreach between ELAP and its stakeholder communities. We do have dialogue in our meetings, especially when we get feedback from the laboratory community about what are the issues that are there, what can ELAP, Christine and her staff do to address those items, and take that information back and follow up with the parties that came before LTAC to bring concerns. Also, we give feedback on operations and improvement of ELAP and the implementation of performance-based transparent accreditation program. That's accountable to the stakeholders as well. I mean, all the laboratories are fee payers, and so they need to make sure they have a feedback loop back to the agency in regards to how things are going and where things can improve. So I'll transition now into the composition of LTAC. We have the designated Environmental Lab Accreditation Program Officer, which is Christine. We have a scribe, ELAP staff member. Kate is in the audience somewhere. She's phenomenal, by the way. Make sure we get all of our information so that we can be prepared as professionals. We all have jobs outside of LTAC to make sure that we come prepared for often fairly beefy meeting packets. There are 18 members currently, a minimum of 14 in the bylaws, I believe. And there's representative members, which are voting members of LTAC. And those are individual experts, as I would say, appointed by the deputy director on behalf of a group, an organization, or another recognized persons that might be able to contribute to LTAC. They represent a broad range of interested parties and environmental laboratories, and those include private and public sector labs, Northern and Southern California, so making sure we recover potentially anything that's regionally important, small and large labs. And then there's a state regulatory agency employees, which are non-voting members. And I want to make sure I get an opportunity today to acknowledge this group of people. I started just pondering for a few moments in preparation for this meeting, and I just went through 3 people, including myself. And that group of 3 people has 100 years of experience in working in laboratories and managing and operating laboratories. So collectively across this 18, there's easily 500 years of experience. These are people that are not in their infancy in their careers. They've been involved in the laboratory community for many years and have a diverse set of experiences to bring to the table to discuss at these meetings. I forgot about that bullet. The agencies that are represented are DDW, CDF, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, State Water Resource Control Board, and the Department of Toxic Substances Control. So the activities I'm going to touch on, we've had 3 meetings since I've been chair, December of 2017, March of 2018, and July of 2018, and we have one coming up next month. And so for a better sense of terms, I've kind of thrown the subject matters that we've discussed over the course of those 3 meetings into 3 buckets, the first one being what I'm calling ELAP operations. I really couldn't come up with a better terminology to kind of capture all of these. At each meeting, we have the DLAPO report covering a variety of items that Christine and her staff may have addressed in the last period of time before our meeting. Much similar items that she covered with you today, ELAP audits, new staff members, QA status, and things of that sort. We've covered fields of accreditation. And what that is there's a variety of fields for which laboratories can be accredited. And they are covered generally by large subject matters. And we've been providing feedback through a work group to ELAP in the concept of proposed reorganization of those fields of accreditation by method and technology. We've had group meetings and feedback on the ELAP fee structure, and those are still ongoing. In fact, there's a stakeholder fee work group the LTAC members participate in, and working with other ELAP staff on that subject matter, or state board staff. Big subject matter for us has been the draft regulations. Several meetings have covered those, and I'm sure that, especially if there's a forthcoming public release, there may be more dialogue about that at LTAC. As required by the bylaws, as required in our bylaws, we must review and update them on a set frequency, and we've just wrapped that up. I expect a vote on those changes at the forthcoming meeting. And then getting down into the weeds of scientific method. There's method detection limit updates for California, and so there's a work group that's working on those as well. In terms of the next bucket is engagement with the state agency partners. As Christine said, I think we've had somewhere around 11 meetings, so there's been far more of those engagements than these that we've had in the last 3, but I did want to touch on those. And the reason these are important is I was pretty vocal at one of our first meetings expressing frustration as a certified lab hearing about something new in a regulation that came out of a regional regulatory authority, a water board or somewhere else. New method, lower limits. And that's the first time you heard about it. And that's very challenging to the labs because those regs have a launching window and then the labs are scrambling. And it's been a concerted effort by LTAC to make sure that we understand through feedback the state agency partners provide to Christine, which then comes to me as the chair about, hey, we need to have a meeting, an agenda item on our meeting to address this. So some of these are, I'm sorry, one more thing. And then what happens from this is often work groups are formed from LTAC, for which we're involved. Public can be involved, ELAP staff, state agency partners can be involved as well, to get down into the weeds of the issue. And we've developed a formal process for outreach to the laboratory community through the database systems that ELAP has for a specific method. Christine mentioned pyrethroids, to make sure that those we get a poll and a survey of the labs of where are their current capabilities on whatever the method issue is. Are they interested in working on the issue, whether it's lower limits or a new method? And what's their timeline for which they think they can achieve? And then that information is brought back, shared with the state agency partners or the agency that's brought in information to us, because they might not be one of the state agency partners represented around the table. So examples are the DDW presentation on water quality data processing changes that are coming in the next 2 years. We had again for DDW, there was a need for some adjustments in the laboratory capabilities in perchlorate. And so a work group was formed to assist in determining capabilities and address those needs for lower limits. Christine, nope, that's the next one. There's also regulatory priorities that might be discussed. DDW requested LTAC assistance in examining several additional detection limits after we finished perchlorate, and kind of formulating laboratory capabilities through a survey and changes in reporting limits. So you can kind of see the analytical chemistry, new limits, lower limits group has been busy. And then more recently, the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board and State Water Board adopted changes to the pyrethroids for the Central Valley region through TMDL and Basin Plan Amendment. And staff came before us and wanted to make sure that LTAC understood what those new limits were going to be, why they were going to be needed. Environmental relevance was the issue, and to form a work group to reach out to the laboratories to address those issues. In addition, one of the particular toxicity test species that's going to be in that policy is a Hyalella. It's an amphipod test, and the agency wanted to make sure they understood laboratory capabilities there. And this is my last slide, and these are basically laboratory information, laboratory items or informational items that we've discussed. As I mentioned earlier, comments from the public are a key part of our discussions and dialogue. The LTAC members have various groups that they might represent. I, for example, represent this kind of oddball group of people that do aquatic toxicology. And so there's both municipal as well as private sector laboratories. I've got an email group, send information out to them, ask them if they have any feedback, and bring it back to LTAC. So we've had a number of presentations from LTAC members giving feedback from their group or groups that they're representing, and that's been helpful as well. We had a recent presentation by Orange County Sanitation District's laboratory that's gone through adopting TNI, the length of time it took them to do it, the expenses, and a lot of it was also the justification on why they felt that it was prudent to move forward with that prior to any adoption of a new regulatory framework in California. We also recently had an independent survey. This is an example of getting feedback from the laboratory community that was unsolicited, a 2017 survey, and that was about a half-hour presentation at one of our recent LTAC meetings, and to give some context to both us as LTAC as well as ELAP staff that are there on what an independent group is hearing from laboratories through a survey. And so that is the wrap up of my presentation, and I welcome any questions you might have.
That's great. Any questions before we move on? We'll just keep moving through since we have a lot of presentations. And then we'll take a short break before we go to public comment when we get to it, because we'll then probably go through the lunch hour or whatever time we need and then let people go to be able to get on to the rest of their day rather than taking a lunch hour break. Welcome. Welcome, sibling.
Members. I'm Bruce LaBelle. I head DTSC's laboratories and also on our exec staff. And I'll give a perspective from the state agency partner committee representing the regulatory labs or regulatory agencies. And what I say is my own views. I don't, obviously everyone has their own, but hopefully there'll be some consensus. And ultimately, the state agency partners provide input to ELAP from the perspective of the state agencies who are the ultimate users of ELAP. ELAP exists because the state agencies either require data, receive data, or use data. That's why ELAP exists. We're the ultimate customers, not the laboratories, not the responsible parties or regulated community. Ultimately, we're the ones who need the information. It's in the regulations. They need it because we require it, in effect. in statutes or regulations. We need data of known, consistent, and documented quality. And when I was hearing Mitzi's presentation, what struck me is, yes, there's a lot of violations, there's a lot of, or deficiencies, I should say. What struck me as much is how can that many deficiencies have been going on since these are not brand new labs or labs that are thrown in a brand new method they've never seen before. And what is in a sense concerning is Mitzi and her colleagues could only assess labs against, as is indicated, what is in the current regulations, the current ELAP regulations, or the specific documents in the laboratory, there's SOPs, et cetera. And they could not step back and say, why were these things occurring? They could not look at the quality of the laboratory. Do they have a system in place, a policy for training their employees on the methods, for ensuring labs, each employee has demonstrated competency before they're running samples, that they have a corrective action process so when there is a deficiency noted that they respond to it. Why should the labs be waiting for a ELAP to audit them? Why don't they have in place a policy for conducting internal audits and management reviews of the overall laboratory? Those are really problems where, in effect, a experienced assessor who helped our laboratory, is helping our laboratory, Ken Staub, he phrased it, if you can't cite it, you can't write it. So Mitzi and her colleagues, there were probably a lot of things that they recognized could be improvements or would have been deficiencies if the labs had even started in the direction toward TNI more, but they weren't able to really write it down or identify more potential what should be deficiencies, but don't even exist because the system doesn't require it to exist, the current ELAP regulations. TNI provides some of the necessary clarity that really identifies all the elements of a laboratory's operation that could affect the quality of the results. So, in fact, the deficiencies that were noted are really despite the weaknesses in the current regulations. It's not because of them being so strong that someone can identify lots of violations. So think of it in that context. And Ken Staub, as he put it again, say what you'll do what you say, document what you did. In a true system, all the different elements of your system you have clearly laid out. TNI gives you flexibility, but it says address these elements of your operations. So all the things that you're doing that could affect your results, say how you're going to address them. And that's whatever you say you're going to do, that's what we're going to assess you against. It's ultimately document what you're going to do and then have records of what you did. It's, in a sense, clear in that sense. It takes work, but it's clear. And it's not a new issue, the types of things that Mitzi was mentioning, the issue of laboratories not or having significant deficiencies, potentially rising the level of lab fraud, but often just deficiencies. 1995, 2006, and 2014, EPA's Office of the Inspector General assessed the lab auditing program, lab accreditation program, laboratories to see how good is our labs really being assessed and how good are labs doing in terms of the quality of the data that's produced, the ultimate results, and they identified deficiencies. So it's been a problem for a long time. Cal EPA itself, back in 1997, a environmental data quality team produced Cal EPA Environmental Data Quality Report. One of the recommendations was TNI, or NELAC at the time, accreditation as a best practice. California still hasn't really implemented it. And when I indicate, I've supported TNI or, equivalent, a high-level standard, California as a leader, the way I think of it is a straight face test. Try stating the opposite. Allow some labs to do less than the best practices the expert review panel identified as critical for confidence in the data. Some labs are saying, oh, it's too onerous, oh, we shouldn't have to do this, oh, we're good, why should we have to do this? Is that the right question they're asking? Have a less robust quality system requirements than those which federal agencies and other states identified as necessary. Other states use TNI. For some federal agencies, DOD, DOE, go beyond TNI. they have DoD QSM-5, Quality Systems and Manual for Laboratory, that goes beyond. It's more specific because they recognize that even that's not, doesn't cover everything that they believe is needed. So is TNI a ceiling or a floor? And California should not follow EPA's recommendation that drinking water labs have an ISO 17025 TNI quality system. 10 years ago, they identified in one of the supplements to their manual for certification of labs the use of ISO 17025 TNI as a best practice, and that builds upon what they had said previously in 1997 and 2002. So this is not a new issue. What I'm hoping the board can do is really help ELAP and keep them moving forward. ELAP's made tremendous progress since it came to the board. I've been aware of ELAP for decades, and it's the changes they've made since they came over, and your support has made a huge difference. They really are a really different organization than they used to be before they came over. So I really want to congratulate you all on your support for the program. One of the biggest things is something that Christine mentioned that I hope you picked up on, and that is that they themselves are working under a quality system themselves. They're not simply doing quality assurance, quality control, trying to do things, shuffling things. They actually are having the system that will result in continual improvement. And internal audits, internal management reviews, and then having external entity come in to help them with that by doing external audits. That's huge. I think the big next step is finalizing the new regulations without another 10 years or 20 years delay. In 2002, approximately 2002, the ELAP regulations, when they were updated, made NELAP, which is now TNI, optional. I hope it won't be optional. We need to help labs comply, not by lowering the standard or making it optional, but we really need to recognize the labs, especially the small labs and really the small municipal labs that that don't have much flexibility in terms of budget. Right. It's huge lift for them. I hope you can find ways of helping ELAP, help them, and help the labs directly, and also ensure that ELAP itself has adequate resources to do the on-site assessments that are really needed. As Mitzi mentioned, on-site assessments by auditor or assessor are valuable. They really build on the internal processes within the lab. But it's huge to have those on-site assessors come in from ELAP who are really the experts and can help a lab that does need some help, not telling them what to do when they're doing, not trying, but they're trying. Now someone comes in and advises them. Anyway, with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Question?
Thank you. Before we move on to hearing from speakers, which I'm looking forward to.
I think there's one more.
Oh, okay, one more. That's right, looking ahead. But just before Christine does her presentation, one of the main focus of discussion is something that you had in one of your quotes, which is document what you did. And that's at the heart of a lot of our challenges at the Water Board related to cost of compliance and how much effort an organization puts into getting the work done versus proving they did what they said they did. There's a balance there. In these discussions, certainly you're pointing to the TNI standard as something that's acceptable. And a lot of the tension in these discussions is about the level of documentation or, the personnel requirements. And if there are methods within the TNI structure to do what's reasonable at a smaller municipal type scale. So where is the room to have flexibility on documenting what you did without overwhelming the workload that needs to be done just to do? There's the do and then there's the document. Where is the room in TNI to make it so municipal labs won't be overwhelmed with the documentation of what they did?
TNI has been implemented by 1- and 2-person labs in the rest of the world. We've had people come and talk to your lab community about that. If you set up concise forms and simple processes, a small lab can implement it, in my opinion, without a great problem. I'm in small labs a lot who have and who've done it without great cost. It's partly understanding the standard, partly setting up a system, partly understanding how to set up documents so they're easy to maintain. And it's not just the documents, but the records, which is the record of the testing. And doing that can be done fairly simply for most labs. It's not that you have to buy a Cadillac when you don't need one. And we have had several lab directors come in from small labs and talk with the lab community. I think more of that is needed. But if you think about it, worldwide, TNI is based on ISO 17025. It is implemented throughout the world for 1- and 2-person labs, and it's implemented for labs of 1,000. And TNI used that as the bottom layer of its foundation. They did not alter that when they put it into the TNI standard. It's the bottom of the layer cake. There are some more specifics, but in most labs, once you have the system set up, it's not very onerous. It actually makes it easier for the lab to see when they have a problem than to hunt through mounds of paper to figure it out and find it. So, you know, I encourage the laboratory community here to move toward more training and explanation, but also remember that you want people who want to implement something to make their systems better. And we need to encourage them to do that and give them the tools. But my opinion is, based on auditing hundreds of labs, that you can do it with a small one or you can do it with a large lab.
Yeah, and it sounds like a lot of the concern out there, the fear that you talked about, and you know, what I hear through the communities is staff are briefing their boards who approve the budgets, and they're reporting pretty high costs to implement TNI, and are kind of scaring the boards around the state about ramping up, and even giving second thoughts to keeping a municipal lab altogether. This is very real, and it's going on as we speak. But let's distill the discussion. The costs that we're talking about have to do with almost a one-time or an activation energy to get a system in place. Mm-hmm. And to your points, I heard in your discussion that efficiencies down the road will save costs if the system is in place.
I agree with that statement wholeheartedly. I've seen labs, you know, it's always it's an upfront outlay of cost. I mean, anytime you implement something new, a new piece of equipment in treatment, a new anything, it costs money to put it out there. And then after you begin to use the system and after you begin to better automate it, it cuts your costs in the long haul. But there is an upfront investment. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what that cost is. But basically, every time, quality isn't free. I mean, let's face it. If I could go out there and never have any documentation on what I did, I could run a really cheap lab. But I want to be able to prove what I did. So there is a bottom line that you can't drop below on cost, or you just don't have any proof. And you don't want to be below that line.
Board Member Moore, if I can chime in. I think I should probably provide some context also from LTAC's history. As the chair, a little bit of history on our activities, because what was proposed to you guys was something different than full TNI. And one of the main reasons that feedback was, or that we went through that process, and it was not a unanimous, I'm sure you guys are not unanimous on a lot of your decisions either. It was a majority and a good number of them. You'd like to be unanimous if you can. I saw you look at each other. You'd like to be unanimous if you can, but that's not often the case. And one of the biggest input factors we had was this small person laboratory issue. And I don't discount what Misty is saying, is that if you have a small person lab where it's a person that's whole responsibility is that laboratory, they can probably go through a supporting documentation, the training that I proposed that occur at a board member some time ago, documents, QA-based documents, that they could probably adopt that pretty readily. what we were hearing was there's a good number of small municipal laboratories that their lab does a limited number of analyses, and that is not the person's only job. They're also doing maybe operations items. They're also wearing a hat somewhere else within their agency. And so we on LTAC, there were definitely members that were ardent full TNI. Many of the state agency partners were ardent. That was the that was the only pathway. And so what we did is we went through and went through TNI and said, well, what are some of the items that might be more onerous and what could be adapted? We weren't going to be full TNI anyway because there was going to be a change in the educational requirements through CWEA type parties, although it looks like TNI might adopt something like that in the future. So hence, that's why LTAC brought forth a change in kind of how to go about that. Something more structured and rigorous to have required internal audits, required corrective actions, required quality manuals, not you describe each lab something different. So that's why you guys got at least the feedback from LTAC on the last time that we were before you in terms of what our proposal was. And it definitely wasn't unanimous, and it was very, very close votes on many of those items. But it was primarily in the context to address that feedback we were receiving from small groups that were saying they were going to have to bow out. They did not have the time or the resources to be able to take on additional responsibilities.
Ms. Sotelo.
All right, so thank you. There's a lot for the program to consider and think about, and how we're going to move forward in the path in improving ELAP. We've done a lot of self-reflection, done a lot of analysis of information, and so I think where we're at right now is, as we become more an effective program, and we have better insight on how the laboratories are doing, I think we're going to have to be refocusing what we do. We still want to focus on our core regulatory functions, but I think our perspective is not only should we be helping to regulate laboratories, but I think our role is to help lift the laboratories in the community and help them provide the information and the data that we expect of California labs to produce. So we're going to refocus, and our role now, I believe, is to transition ELAP. We got a roadmap from the expert panel. They told us exactly what we need to do. I believe our mantra now is really stay the course. I know this is sobering information, but we know what we need to do, and we should be implementing it. We know the nature and extent, but I think if we stay the course, we will see improvements, and we want to help lift up the labs. Now that we've learned, more about how to be a better program and evaluate lab performance, the question is, how do we actually quantify performance? You heard the on-site assessment findings from those drinking water labs, but we're like any other regulatory program. We inspect, we monitor, and we enforce. And I want to cover those three things to give you an idea of how we're evaluating and quantifying laboratory performance here in California. So I don't have to tell you again what you heard from Mitzi in her presentation about on-site assessments. When we're on the site, in the laboratory, inspecting it, we're seeing 70% of those drinking water labs that we assessed are not performing at the level we expect. And it doesn't make us comfortable. And that's 1/3 of our lab population. We have 2 other thirds of it, which is wastewater and drinking water, hazardous waste labs. And so we're concerned about the condition of those labs. But we have some ideas, and I'll tell you a little in just a couple of minutes. The other way, I mentioned our core regulatory function is to monitor labs. So you heard about what we're doing and what we're finding while we're in the laboratory. Well, when we monitor the laboratories and we're reviewing the proficiency testing reports for laboratories that have to pass each method that they're accredited for, we're also finding similar problems. 74% of the laboratories that submit applications or their annual PT report have deficiencies. They're either not passing, they're not reporting appropriately, or they're not even participating in the study. You heard a lot about quality systems. So we believe that if there was a quality systems in there, that a lot of these things would improve. But again, we're in the laboratory, we're seeing something, we're monitoring them remotely, and we're also seeing a problem. And then the last way is enforcement. How busy are we? We're really busy. As you can see, since we've moved over from CDPH, we've had 67 referrals. Of those, they've resulted in enforcement actions. One was a criminal case that we had, and then we've denied, revoked, suspended, and withdrawn a lot of laboratories, methods, and accreditation because we are seeing some problems that rise to the level of taking enforcement. So we have some issues that we need to deal with, but we have some ideas. And we want to stay the course, and I want to share with you some ideas on how we can help lift the laboratories and not only address our core function of regulating them, but also help them at the same time. So you heard from Mitzi, laboratories are having technical issues. And when you think about any organization, you want to look at the top. You want to see who's hiring them, who's ensuring that they're onboarding them, who's ensuring they have initial demonstration capability of that instrument or that they know how to run that method. It's the laboratory director, technical manager, or quality assurance officer. So we want to explore some sort of training for the laboratory community to help them know how to run a laboratory and quality management systems. We think this will help lift them up. We also would like to help them by identifying staff on ELAP that can provide them assistance. This would be just short term. Again, it's outside of our core regulatory function, but I've been at the board for a while. Outreach and education is something that we want to help and do, and so this is something we could help bring in for just a short time period to address the compliance issues at the laboratories that we see are underperforming. And the last idea is potentially extending another assessment contract. You heard from Mitzi, she only assesses drinking water labs. Again, that leaves the 2/3 of laboratories in our population that are not being assessed by experts in the field like Mitzi. We're not done with our training. As you heard from Mitzi, we just shadowed the staff, and now we're gonna switch gears, and they're going to shadow us. So we're still not capable and don't have the number of staff to conduct all of the assessments at the level that you're seeing is necessary from those drinking water labs on the other side. We can't perform follow-up verification assessments of the drinking water labs that Mitzi has assessed to ensure that we're following up and making sure they comply, but we have concern with the other part of our population that are not getting this level of assessment. So those are our ideas. Thank you for listening to the panel, and I'm happy to take any questions if you like.
Thank you. Questions before we take a short break?
Real quick clarification on that pretty important point about the two other sectors. This was, so to repeat, today we had a drill down exercise with the drinking water laboratories. Has there been any, or how would you characterize the current assessment approach with wastewater and hazardous waste? Because it's not zero, but what level are we at now, and where would you like to go?
For the other wastewater labs and hazardous waste labs, for the current level of education that we have, I think we're doing fine. We can always improve. What we're doing is we're learning and integrating what we learned from Mitzi step by step. We're not waiting to implement everything. We're kind of integrating it. We're probably going to switch to the same on-site assessment report that Mitzi and her team are using. So we're learning through osmosis what they're training us. So the assessments, again, they are difficult because it's method-based audits. It's based on regulations that you have all heard, testimony, and from expert panel that they're very hard to cite. But it's mostly method-based. So we have found the same problems on the wastewater side as we have on the drinking water side.
Can I just so I'm clear on what it is you're saying in here, it may be a similar question or maybe slightly different. So when Ms. Miller talked about the going through a third of them and having 2/3 to go, that's 2/3 to go to finish the drinking water labs. And then for the wastewater and the hazardous waste labs, what you're saying is you want to cover them, but your staff is going to cover them, or you are going to do a similar kind of a contract to
Similar kind of a
assess them?
contract.
Okay, good. Good.
Chair Marcus, if I may, before we go for a break.
Yeah, sure.
Christine and I had a really good dialogue last week in regards to some of the proposals she was putting forward. And from LTAC, I'll have to just put on one voting member's hat rather than speaking for the entire LTAC. Two key things that we've been focusing on besides regulations and fees and all the kind of operational has been outreach and education. And the outreach has, and Christine indicated it's not necessarily one of the core obligations of the program, and talked about that as a short-term maybe position or positions that might be needed. I would argue that might be something that might be needed for a longer term until the concerns and questions of the state agency partners and assessors are remedied. Secondarily, for education, the first thing that popped up in my mind when Christine was sharing with me Missy's kind of synopsis is, well, that's not an analyst problem if the method's not being followed. It's the quality assurance program officer in the laboratory, and if they're not doing their job, it's the director, technical director's problems. And so from my perspective, funds that would help support outreach and education for quality assurance oversight and technical director oversight is clearly justified based upon the information that's been brought forward today. It will not hurt, and if anything, it's going to improve the circumstances within the lab community.
It's interesting when you think about it as an attitudinal thing. I mean, I'm going back to something Ms. Sotelo said at the beginning, and a transition that we've made in the drinking water program in general in terms of being able to ask for support for it, which is you can be a regulatory agency and spank people, or you can figure out how to be a partner to get to the objective that we want for Californians, which is all about public health and safety. I think frequently we sit here and we bandy back and forth about our roles as we perceive them, as opposed to figuring out how to keep our eye on the right ball. So I appreciate that comment. Let's take a 10-minute break. I apologize for going so late. I suggest that if you need, I don't know how long this will take, quite a few speakers, that you grab something in the cafe to tide you over until you can have your lunch. And we come back, virtually all the speakers have asked for just 3 minutes it's an information item, not a regulatory item, to tell us what to think about. I have one who asked for 10. It's going to be 3, as much as I love that person, because the point of this conversation is just to tell us what we ought to be thinking about as we move forward. We don't have an action in front of us, and I appreciate people's comments on where we should go, as well as any reactions to what I see as pretty alarming findings. So I don't want to minimize that at all. And different than the conversations we've had before, so thank you for teeing it up. 10 minutes. Yeah, welcome back all. Great, I'll call speakers in groups of 3, so you have a little, you don't have to worry about a surprise being called on sort of thing. First, we'll have Debbie Webster from the Central Valley Clean Water Association, followed by Adam Link from CASA and the Clean Water Summit Partners, followed by Adam Borchardt from Aqua.
There we go. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't sure. Well, thank you. Good morning, Chair Marcus and board members. I'm Debbie Webster. I'm with the Central Valley Clean Water Association. And I just wanted to say for 2 parts that I really appreciate the presentations and the update that was given from staff and from all speakers this morning. It brought to light kind of 2 areas that I want to talk about, one being the accreditation system that we're going through, and then also just the thought of what we need to do to improve our labs and to understand and work on things. So first I want to start on the accreditation system. As you probably know, SWRCB has always supported a dual track system. We recognize that there's a need to have a accreditation system that works both for our smaller facilities and remote facilities, and then also for public entities. And our labs, we believe our labs are a very valuable asset to the wastewater treatment plant and to just understanding what is going on in the process. The labs provide an early response and some continuity on running and on how we run and see what's happening with the quality of water that we're putting out into the environment. And that helps the wastewater treatment plant to protect both human health and the environment. Our labs provide that necessary service to the wastewater treatment plant, but the lab is not there on its own. And from that, that's where many of our concerns with TNI, as you know, have started. We recognize that TNI it can be really beneficial for commercial labs or for other labs. You heard about Orange County, but that's a business decision. But we need to have something that's going to work, and it needs to be quality. We are not about not quality. It needs to have. We want quality data just as much, I think, as you do. So from that, SWRCB, through its lab community, and we have a really strong lab community in the Central Valley, we spend a lot of time trying to understand TNI, how it could be implemented, what are some aspects that might be kind of controversial or hard to implement. And from that, we submitted a comment letter that really outlined some very specific things within TNI that we thought were necessary to modify in order for it to be implementable in our regions. Following that, we just basically had heard that, hey, we can only make these 2 modifications to TNI or else it won't be TNI, so that kind of throws that out. And from that, what we really understand is we do need something that's more dual track. We need something that works for our public entities. At our last board meeting that I spoke on this issue for, we talked about test driving the TNI at a public agency kind of before those regulations were put out and we're kind of still waiting for that. Oh gosh, this went fast. Can I have 2 more minutes or a minute? I'll go fast.
Wrap up your second
Okay, sure.
point. Yeah.
We'd like to still see that. We haven't seen really the results of that other than what you heard at Orange County, which is one of the 5 largest in California. So we'd like to see that again at a smaller level. But I think on the other part, as we talked about some of these deficiencies that were highlighted today, our lab community is strong. Whether you're talking about SWRCB, you're talking about CWA or BACWA or SCAP, we want to do the right thing and we want to do the job right. And so we really want to partner. We want to get those results of those audits that we're seeing and help be out there on the ground floor implementing this before all this other stuff is kind of going on in a sense that the data is being analyzed. If we have some of that raw data and we understand what's going on and we see what the deficiencies are, we can get that information out to our labs and have them start working on that now. And so really what I'm offering is both on the regulations and on just lab improvement, we want to be partners. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Ms. Webster. So this issue has been really interesting because this is not the first time it's come before us, and it's been quite some time, and I really appreciate all that staff has done and the stakeholders. But for me personally, it depends on who's in the room at the time. I seem to be convinced. And so whether it's, our staff and others that raise the challenges about the deficiencies and the need, we're really lagging behind in California. On that day, I feel like we need to go with ELAP all the way. But then I'll sit down with you and others, and then I struggle with this issue, not just on the issue of getting up to speed, whether it's a dual system or full-blown ELAP, but the concern that I have...
TNI, you mean, not you.
I'm sorry, TNI, yeah. The concern that I have is on the issue of these smaller programs, smaller facilities, and potential lack of access. So if you could maybe comment on that, or maybe think about it and get back to us on that, because there are probably many labs that are deficient, whether it's through outreach, education, or maybe a contract service. There's a lot of different ways to do the testing. But in smaller communities where maybe they don't have access to these other facilities, a contract lab and other facilities, I'm concerned about lack of access if they don't meet the mark. So if you could comment on that.
And that is a concern. There is concern. There's concern, if you talk about even a private lab, there's a concern about hold times and how much business you actually could produce in order to support a lab within those timeframes. So we have those real concerns. I think on some of the lack of access, one of the things that Civiqua's lab community has identified is that training is not part of the current system, and that it needs to be added. And so and how we would, I'm like, so there's aspects of it that we've really looked and said, yeah, we need to do improvement. How can we start getting engaged in there to help that? But on another kind of layer of this, as when we looked at, when you look at these audits and try to figure it out, I think what I heard was, well, we weren't able to really get down to what is this and why is this being caused, where I think our community actually might be able to do and address that. And so, but a part of it is trying to understand, what is it that's there? What is the parts that are deficient? How can we engage? And what I see is a lot of mentoring. So this, by discussion, by coming together, we learn from each other. And we have people that will go out and they'll mentor, or they'll go out and they'll talk to other people, or they'll make a phone call. Hey, did you hear about this? There's that kind of interaction that you get through our associations that is invaluable to our members. And so I think that there's more discussion there, but if that helps a little bit.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And in many instances, you can probably hit the mark on TNI, but if you're asking for dual, I think you need to show where you have that need specifically. And again, getting to the issue of access, there may be areas where the labs, because of someone wearing multiple hats, but maybe they're next to another community or another system, and they can have a shared service or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I'm particularly concerned, and I think we just need to pull out the map and have a better sense of what areas of the state could we end up seeing truly a lack of access to a certified lab.
Okay, thank you. I will help working on that. So
Okay,
thank you.
thanks.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Mr. Link, followed by Mr. What? Oh, you had a question? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say really quick that I also have that concern, Board Member Diadamo, and I've talked to staff a bit about, how do we ourselves have a better understanding where there can be perhaps a lack of capacity for the labs, where we might see trouble spots, and use that to help us focus our technical assistance then on those communities or those areas. And that really begins with, having a really good understanding of where our labs are, just geospatially, just where the problem areas might be, or where we might see labs go ahead and drop out of the program because of trouble with compliance with current standards, let alone TNI, and use that data to help us better than direct, again, those technical assistance resources. So I share that concern with you.
Great. Good morning.
Mr. Link, followed by Mr. Borchardt, followed by Sarah Burke from Kauai.
Thank you. Adam Link on behalf of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, CASA, as well as here today on behalf of the Clean Water Summit Partners, which is the California Water Environment Association, CWEA, Bay Area Clean Water Association or Agencies, which is BACWA, Southern California Alliance of POTWs, which is SCAP, and Central Valley Clean Water Association, which Debbie Webster just spoke for. So the whole acronym soup of municipal wastewater agencies. That's what the Summit Partners is. The Summit Partners recently submitted a letter to the Water Board members and ELAP program staff expressing our support for exploring a dual accreditation system that offers state accreditation as well as TNI accreditation within the ELAP structure. I'm here today to simply reiterate our support for that request. Just as some background, CASA and the Summit Partners have been participating in this process since 2015. We have membership on the LTAC and actively participate there. We've been part of stakeholder groups. We've sent comment letters at various stages of the process. And all throughout that process, we have expressed a similar concern about exploring exclusively the TNI track. And the reason for that is twofold, primarily because of the administrative burdens that are associated with that standard and the impact that adoption would have on smaller municipal labs, and whether that would provide any corresponding water quality benefits or if it was just for that sake. And I think Board Member Moore sort of articulated the issue very well when he asked this question. And we believe requiring TNI for all labs in the state could fundamentally shift investment from scientific personnel to administrative personnel. And that's deeply concerning for a number of our members. I think, one of the panelists here said it wasn't a Cadillac per se, and I think the analogy that, not to extend it too far, but I think of it more as a Corvette and a Camaro, right? They're both Chevys, they're both sports cars, but not everybody needs the Corvette, and so what we're asking for is kind of a dual...
everybody needs a Corvette.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that. I apologize. I'm from LA, I can't help it.
So under a dual system, larger labs with a wider range of responsibilities and sufficient resources to implement TNI should be free to pursue that course, and other labs would be allowed to seek state accreditation without undergoing all of the steps required by TNI per se. The other thing that struck me from a number of the presentations that were here today was that a lot of the improvements that they were seeing in labs, or that were able to be seen after audits and those types of things, weren't necessarily dependent on the standard that you were looking at, right? Those aren't TNI based. Those are other types of activities that ELAP program can engage in, that labs can engage in, that aren't based on TNI, but that also result in improved lab performance. And finally, one of the other things Board Member Diadamo just mentioned is that she's in meetings and saying, she's convinced that, ELAP is right in one instance and the labs may be right on this in the other instance. At the end of the day, there are very convincing arguments on both sides, but I think I have to trust my labs when they say, we are not able to implement the TNI program fully without laying off staff, without closing, without doing all those things. And so that's what we're hearing from our community, and that's why we're here expressing that concern today about adoption of the TNI standard. So a lot of the other folks that are going to speak will speak on very specific issues, but really our core message on behalf of the broader Summit Partners group is to please explore this issue of dual accreditation very seriously as this moves forward. So thank you very much.
Mr. Borchardt, followed by Ms. Burke, followed by Jonathan Young for the California Municipal Utilities Association. Hi.
All right. Good morning. It's still morning. Chair Marcus and fellow board members, my name is Adam Borchardt. I'm speaking on behalf of the Association of California Water Agencies. ACWA appreciates the opportunity to comment on this issue. First and foremost, ACWA would like to thank Deputy Director Polhemus, Ms. Sotelo, and ELAP staff for their extensive outreach to the laboratory community, including working with LTAC, the Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee. While ACWA understands that the State Water Board desires to complete the overhaul of ELAP, we still have unresolved concerns about a TNI-only approach, and this was outlined in a joint comment letter we submitted with the California Municipal Utilities Association last year, dated September 7th, 2017. As the board is aware, ACWA is concerned that the implementation of TNI-only track would be costly for the implementation of an accreditation program and would not necessarily lead to better quality results. An alternative would be this dual track where some labs could opt for TNI and others that are not TNI certified could still gain accreditation. There may be an increase in the cost, but it could be far less costly than with full implementation of TNI. And this would be potentially beneficial for labs that are more remote areas of California where labs are generally less common and where labs are generally smaller in size. Additionally, ACWA requests that the board strongly consider recommendations from the LTAC committee, particularly the decision to support an alternative regulatory approach, such as the US EPA certification process. If the board does decide to continue with implementation of TNI, ACWA hopes that the board would, or ELAP staff would conduct a fiscal analysis, the impact on small and rural laboratories, and would also continue to set aside funds for the implementation of TNI. And ACWA appreciates the funding that has been set aside already for the trainings that have been provided. So, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Burke, followed by Mr. Young, followed by Amber Baylor from the South Orange County Wastewater Authority.
Hi. Hello. Board members, Chair Marcus, and ELAP staff, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Sarah Burke, plant chemist at Ora Loma Sanitary District. I'm also the chair of the California Water Environment Association Lab Committee. CWEA has over 10,000 members, and its mission is education and training of wastewater professionals. As chair of Lab Committee, I'm speaking for our 42 committee members and also for the 850 lab analysts that CWEA has certified. At our last Lab Committee meeting, we discussed the option of a dual-track lab certification system, understanding we would need to pay higher fees to support a better, stronger, faster ELAP program. At the end of the discussion, we took a vote, and it was unanimously in favor of the dual-track system. Like I said earlier, CWEA's mission is to train and educate its members. That's why we've been leading the way in providing TNI training. We want and need to support ELAP, and we've enjoyed ELAP's presentations at our annual conferences for a few years now. We don't mind spending money on improving environmental quality. For instance, at my plant, we've just started a voluntary plant upgrade for nutrient removal, which will benefit the San Francisco Bay. But spending a lot of money on getting a TNI lab certification won't improve the environment. And for labs that don't adopt TNI and have no other certification, the quality and frequency of the analysis may go down. Again, thank you for listening today. I've appreciated this opportunity to let you know the lab community believes in the two-track system. Let's let labs make the choice that works best for them. We look forward to continuing our partnership with ELAP and with you, and to protecting our waterways. Now, after listening to this morning's presentations, I actually came up with something more personal I wanted to say. This was from CWEA, what I just read. But now I'd like to add, Mr. Moore, earlier you asked Mrs. Miller if she thought adopting TNI was very difficult or small labs could do it. She replied, 1- and 2-person labs around the world have adopted it. Now, when you ask Mrs. Miller if we should adopt TNI, she's going to say yes. She was on the ERP that recommended it. She was awarded the contract to do these assessments with ELAP. She and her firm are guaranteed work for life if we adopt TNI as our only lab standard, as she'll be doing the lab assessments in her firm. I've been told to assess my lab, it'd be $2,500 to $3,000 for an on-site assessment. I know for larger labs, it can be $10,000. So just keep that in mind when you ask certain people their opinions. Thank you.
Mr. Young, followed by Ms. Baylor, followed by Josie Tellers from the Civiqua Lab Committee and the City of Davis.
Good afternoon by a minute. My name is Jonathan Young. I'm with the California Municipal Utilities Association. Board members and chairs, thank you so much for allowing me to speak today. I want to first commend ELAP staff for their incredible outreach to a lot of these stakeholders, particularly Deputy Director Polhemus as well as Chief Sotelo. They've kept us very involved in the process, and we're very thankful for that. A lot of my comments have already been said, so I think I just wanted to touch on the fact that, as my partner from Aqua had mentioned, we still have a lot of the concerns that were shared in our letter in 2017. I think this past regulatory session has also shown the need to keep as many labs open as possible with the recent inclusion of lead testing as well as the future testing for microplastics. I think keeping as many labs open as possible is a very important part of this program. One of the things I think we've seen today is somewhat of a lack of comparative data to give an idea of what this program will cost to implement. And so I'm hoping if the board does decide to go forward with full implementation of TNI, that prior to the formal regulatory package is released, that if there is a fiscal analysis done, we would like to see that as soon as possible to understand the cost implications that this will have on labs of small, medium, large size, and also varying on where they are in rural and more urban areas. Additionally, I think one of the things that would be interesting to see from one of the presentations we saw earlier in the deficiencies of the labs is a comparison to whether or not those labs included TNI labs and a comparison of how TNI audit results are posted as well. I think it would just be interesting to see from my perspective how TNI accredited labs compare to current California ELAP labs. With that, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity. CMUA does support the dual accreditation, and we look forward to working with ELAP staff in the future.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I might, on that point, when it comes to the data around the audits, is it possible to be, does it exist currently on our site somewhere? If not, would it be possible to sort of open up that data in a way that, I'm sure there's maybe confidentiality issues with identifying specific labs, but I don't know in what way that might be anonymized, but allow for the stakeholder community and everyone else to be able to see the data and read what they might intuit or be able to do their own analyses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, question / request. I don't know if, is it, are we able to do that? Or, what would sort of prevent us from doing so?
Yeah, I think that we could look into doing that. We would have to, like you said, kind of scrub the names, et cetera. So we'll look into how we could do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to get at is that I think, when an audit is conducted, obviously an audit will always find deficiencies. I don't think whether it's in business or labs, an audit will ever come back 100% clean. And so my understanding was, if audits are conducted in the current ELAP format and you have these deficiencies, not so much the deficiencies that are written, but the percentage, the amount that are discovered, if those are the same in the other labs. I was just trying to look for some sort of consistency in which all types of labs are experiencing a percentage or a number of deficiencies. That's what I was trying to get at. Yes. To some extent, yes.
Hello and good morning. Thank you. And then let me just see if I can, okay. Okay, very good. I practiced this presentation about 5 or 6 times, and so I think I can get it down to 5 minutes though. Okay, again, my name is Amber Baylor, Director of Environmental Compliance for the South Orange County Wastewater Authority, and we're a 10-member JPA, and we have 5 laboratories, and the laboratories, they span from 1-person labs, we have 2 1-person labs, all the way to 25-person labs. My lab, my fantastic lab, has 6 full-time employees. So we're going to skip right over this because I think we're all aware of all of our underlying regulations. I'm going to move right into Section 64415 of Title 22 requires that analysis should be in accordance to U.S. EPA methods. And there's been a lot of, for people that have never worked in a lab or done any of this, it's kind of, I felt like today would be a great way to give us a context, right, for these regulations. So I completed a crosswalk of all of the drinking water approved methods. I looked at over 1,700 approved methods in 40 CFR Part 141. And what you see here is a percentage of the reference of standard methods in the method as an approved methods. These could be different additions. And so, what Christine and her staff have to do to actually get up to kind of this crosswalk, which was referenced earlier, is a difficult task at best. And I'm speaking of experience from this because I've done that same crosswalk, put a system together for a 4-person laboratory in my previous life. So, for those of you who are not aware, standard methods, it's the gold standard, 133 years of, 113 years of scientific method development. Standard methods in the 23rd edition. WEF, the AWWA, and the American Public Health Association are also members of supporting these methods. And all of the QA and QC that are in standard methods, this book right here, we call it the Bible of the Water Quality Laboratories, have standard method, have quality assurance and quality control methods, documentation requirements intrinsic in every single method that's in this book. So not only does it in every method group, it's also in the very beginning section of this. And I'd like to just, one part of it says, this process documents the criteria for defensible decision-making before an environmental data collection and an activity begins. So this is intrinsic in all the methods, data quality, and has been for quite some time. So now let's move into the, I guess the formatting didn't really come through, for the total coliform roll. So what you see here today is a sample, and I took this from the bathroom of the Cal EPA women's restroom. And I know it's for effect, right? And so what I wanted to show is that this sample right here, I'm going to walk you through the QA/QC requirements for just today that we have. And in fact, this sample would probably, through an evaluation, give me about 10 deficiencies in its current state. This is required from a variety of audit requirements. I don't have a cooler. I don't have a certified thermometer that's accompanying the sample. There's a variety of issues with the sample today. And I think that the work done to actually provide laboratories with assistance to make sure that they are compliant is an important piece of this whole discussion. So, was that 3 minutes or 5 minutes? Okay, great. So I have a couple more minutes. I will spare you from all of the requirements, but this is what I say, that this is the sample collection, sample analysis, and sample reporting. This is the top 7 elements of this. Every single process within these different criteria have an extensive amount of documentation. So there are all referenced in the various qualified methods. So I'm going to go right into personnel costs. This is me and my lab staff. I did a quick picture of them right in the middle of a bunch of different analyses. But what I want to let you know is that this is a very expensive proposition, a single track system. So when I look at this one simple sample alone, for my laboratory to onboard a person, and we've done this crosswalk, it's an additional $1.31 sample increase in cost for every single sample. Now, City of Sacramento, I looked at their consumer confidence report. They're doing about 3,000 samples per year. So that's just an increase in just the one sample. So I think, reference to SB 617 as it relates to major regulation status is applicable in this discussion because these have real cost impacts. I have to go to my board. I have to tell them exactly why I need the actual additional person and all the requirements associated with that. And this is the great science work that we're doing. I won't bore you with all the details. Now, we commend Christine Sotelo and Jacob Akzaka for prioritizing an update to Title 22. And we think that that's a very important priority step, and there's a lot that still work that needs to be done, as Ms. Miller actually alluded to as far as the work. We have expressed willingness and offered more money for ELAP to fulfill this and many other tasks that it needs, which was further elucidated in the Summit Partners letter. So now more than ever, we want to work with ELAP to make sure that they have the funding available to do their task. An increase to my laboratory of $131,000 compared to an additional couple $1,000 increase to give ELAP the resources it needs to do the hard work is much better from a cost-benefit perspective. So I'll leave you with, 17th century French poet, playwright, and author Molière, "In reasonable haste is the direct road to error." And with that, I would like for us to pause and work together a little bit more to improve data quality across the state.
Ms. Tellers, followed by Mr. Jepson, followed by Melissa Thorm, also on behalf of SCAP. Hi.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and board members. My name is Josie Tellers. I'm the Water Quality Coordinator for City of Davis. It's good to see you again. It's been a whole year, I think, the last time I spoke in front of you. I'm also here on behalf of the Civipo Lab Committee. I currently chair that committee, and also I'm an active member of the State CWEA Committee, and of course, interacted with various public agencies with in-house laboratories, a representative from in-house laboratories. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank you for supporting ELAP Chief Christine Sotelo in strengthening ELAP staff's technical and audit capability by providing funding to facilitate assistance and training from NV5. I also would like to thank Mitzi for providing us with data based from the recent audit conducted by an experienced, strong in technical and auditing capability. And therefore, the findings that you saw earlier today would have been findings that should have been found a while back. When we started this journey a couple years ago, and as one of the members of the State Advisory Committee, partnering with the expert review panel put together by SWRCB, I'm one of the members that strongly support dual track accreditation program for state of California. I'm standing here in front of you today saying the same advocacy to promote dual track accreditation system for California, and also in support of the Summit Partners. As Sarah had mentioned earlier, she is currently the chair of the CWA associations, and one of our mission is to educate and provide training to our members. There are various, to show our due diligence and work partnership with ELAP, CWA is sponsoring various meetings in multiple locations between Northern and Southern California about TNI. Now, on behalf of our members, we're attending this training session not necessarily because we agree that TNI is the only standard, but our primary purpose is this time around we can speak with more education knowledge about the standard, but because we're going through the sessions. And therefore, again, our concern is how it's going to impact small laboratories in adopting this modified TNI standard that only have 2 modifications made. Now, dual track standard is not a new idea. We have other states that already adopted or used the same standard. The state of Virginia, they had 2 dual track standards, one for non-commercial laboratories and one for commercial laboratories. State of Oregon mandates TNI standard to drinking water labs, but allows flexibility to wastewater labs as on a voluntary basis. I am fortunate that I worked for commercial laboratories for 19 years and 16 years with public agency, City of Davis. Having experience working for both sectors and following the same analytical methods that Amber had presented, that, by the way, is also the Bible for 40 CFR Part 136 for wastewater labs. I can attest that the data of known and documented quality are also being produced following the current ELAP regulations. And with that, thank you. I'll be happy to answer your any questions.
No, thank you very much. Nice to see you again. Mr. Jepson, followed by Ms. Thorne, followed by Mindy Buell from City of Vacaville.
Hello, Chair Marcos, Board, ELAP team. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Steve Jepson, the Executive Director for Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works. And as you've heard, a TNI-only lab accreditation system is going to result in significant economic cost to the water wastewater labs in California with no tangible benefit to public health or the environment. The lab community who have implemented TNI have indicated it takes 1/2 to 1 full-time employee for startup and ongoing compliance. The full cost of 1/2 of a full-time employee with overhead, benefits, and pension easily approaches $100,000 with a conservative estimate. The Southern California area has well over 200 labs that would be affected by this regulation. That equates to an annual cost of $20 million per year. There are over 600 labs in the state. That would be well over $60 million per year in the state. That's a significant cost, and that triggers a significant regulation, which requires, as you know, state-certified cost-benefit analysis. We've not seen a cost-benefit analysis to date. What we currently see is a high cost with no benefit for the public or environment with a TNI-only requirement. The TNI implementation will result in more lab administrative responsibilities without a benefit of better science, better scientific results. It's administrative staff that we're adding. It will divert attention away from actual water testing and analysis towards administrative duties. A TNI-only system will be particularly challenging for rural and small water wastewater plant labs, which are frequently in lower income areas. A TNI-only program is not consistent with the State Water Board right to water or environmental justice initiatives. If a TNI-only lab accreditation system is promulgated, the pattern will likely unfold as follows. Several labs will forfeit their accreditation. Water samples will be sent out to for-profit TNI labs. The result will be increased hold times, which can affect water quality issues, and longer delayed response times for results. Longer response times will result in less frequent treatment plant tuning. Less frequent treatment plant tuning will result in effluent quality variations, less efficient plant operations. Plants will consume more energy and not perform as well. Once a lab forfeits accreditation, it will be challenging for management to justify investment in new, improved, or replacement lab equipment because they're no longer accredited. So that furthers the downward spiral of on-site testing and plant optimization. SCAP and other lab-focused agencies have made several attempts to engage ELAP staff with meaningful information exchange. We haven't benefited from that to date. The ELAP outreach has been a continuous TNI commercial. The Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee, LTAC, recommendations have not been followed consistently. Furthermore, if TNI truly offers laboratory quality benefits, why aren't the agency partner labs adopting TNI? We had a terrific presentation from Dr. Bruce LaBelle with quotes of document what you do. I would have a quote for the agency partners, which is lead by example. The expert review panel was stacked with TNI affiliated representatives. This represents a conflict of interest and potentially a fair political practice issue. SCAP's members have a fiduciary responsibility to their ratepayers to optimize expenses towards public health and the environment. We're facing many challenges: climate change obligations, air emission enhancements. We've had a group of Southern California ocean outfall owners meet with Region 9 to discuss collaborative plume tracking modeling. And we also have enhanced water quality objectives coming up with further regulations that you're familiar with. So in closing, I want to say that SCAP and the member agencies and our other affiliations stand ready to work with ELAP. We have lots of expertise, lots of experience. We have lab professionals that donate their time to organizations like CWA to provide training and outreach. They apply for local and state awards. These are high-performing professional water quality people, and their recommendations and input are very valuable. And together we could create a very robust dual accreditation system that would benefit the public and the environment at a lower cost than full TNI. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Thorm, followed by Ms. Tell me if I'm saying it right. Bowl, followed by Ray Colise. Also tell me how to say that, from the 29 Palms Water District.
Hi. Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Thorne from Downey Brand, representing SCAP today, and it's nicer to be up here where I can actually see your faces. I couldn't really see you from back there.
I know, I don't know how they do it.
So I just wanted to reiterate some of the points that have been made already today and won't take a whole lot of your time, but as you know, both state statutes and federal regulations govern laboratory control procedures. So the Environmental Lab Accreditation Act, the ELAA in California, and also the federal regulations, 40 CFR Part 136 and Part 141 for wastewater and drinking water standards. The dual track system was anticipated by our legislature as both TNI and the state accreditation, ELAP, are discussed as two different things in AB 1438 as codified in the Health and Safety Code at 100-825, both C11 and 15, and are discussed as either TNI or ELAP accreditation throughout the ELAA. If the legislature had wanted us to have a single track system, they could have done that. As previous speakers mentioned, the cost to impose TNI as a single track has enormous financial impact and triggers the major regulatory status under SB 617, which is defined in Government Code 11342.548 as having an economic impact on California business, enterprises, and individuals in an amount exceeding $50 million. So a dual track system represents a reasonable alternative under that statute that is less burdensome, equally effective in achieving the purposes, and will lessen any adverse impacts, which is required under section 11346.2. The only recent regulation from the State Board that we are aware of that has triggered major regulatory status was the 123 TCP regulations, which proclaim a public health benefit. With the TNI, we are unaware of any proposed benefit to justify the large cost, and arguments that the TNI creates more legally defensible data is not explained or correct. If you do the data with compliance with the standard methods, that is the defensible way to have data. Finally, as discussed, we are concerned about the optics of how TNI is being pushed as the only option. After creating a detailed timeline of the events from information that we gathered from people involved with LTAC and from Public Record Act requests, we believe there may be ethical or FPPC violations, and we're currently considering options available to address these concerns that arise predominantly from the fact that all of the expert review panel members that were analyzing the use and recommending the use of TNI in California were somehow or at some point affiliated with or received compensation from TNI. So we, as we talked about for all the reasons given to you today, we think that the dual track is the preferable option for California. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bull?
Hello, I'm Mindy Boley. That's okay.
But City of Vacaville Water Quality Manager. I'm also a member of pretty much every alphabet group that you've heard out here today, but most importantly to me is that I've been a very active and probably outspoken member of LTAC for the last 3 years as well. I wasn't going to speak today, I wasn't planning on it, but just a few things came up that I'd like to address. The first that came up was the question back about an initial outlay versus a cost benefit down the road. And I don't think we want to put a whole lot of credit into that thought, in that there have been white papers presented, they're in the LTAC meeting notices, about the state of New York and the state of Florida, where they first went to TNI, a lot of labs got full TNI accredited, and then down the road dropped it because the continued expense was more than they were willing to participate. I think you can ask, I don't know, maybe Stephen on a person who has a TNI lab. There is a continued expense with being TNI that you do not have over a regular California ELAP certified lab. So I just don't want to say, I don't want you to believe that, yes, there's this huge cost and then the benefit outweighs that, because I don't think that that has totally been proven, or that it's cheaper down the road because of that. So another issue that came up is that, through CWA, I've been a huge proponent in trying to work with ELAP and make something work. I think we were all in agreement at LTAC at the very beginning. The California standard needs to be improved. There are aspects of TNI that I absolutely love, that I'm in the process of trying to get implemented in my lab. It's a long process, but we're working towards it. City of Vacaville actually just sent me to New Orleans to the TNI conference in August so that I could try to learn more about it. So I'm not at all afraid of TNI, or, it's not that I don't want to put in the work. I want there to be value in the work. And the aspects that I think are very important are the things that the LTAC, the majority of LTAC that voted for way back 2 years ago now, was the California Plus version of a standard that was basically, revise the California standard, include those aspects of it, but not all the other stuff that you don't see the actual benefit to. So I just wanted to put that out there that, we're not against TNI as a whole. It's, we are doing training. I'm a big part of setting up training at the conference in New Orleans. I recruited people from New York, Texas. I have somebody from Kansas coming to speak at CWA workshops next year in February and in April to train California people. And we're mainly focusing on the aspects that I think, whether TNI goes forward in whole force or, a modified version, these are aspects that California labs need to pick up and improve on to maybe help with some of these findings that Mitzi has found. So it's going to be beneficial either way. We're working towards it, but that does not mean that we 100% endorse the TNI. The last thing that I really just wanted to touch on is part of that TNI training, and it was just last week. We had one of these sessions for how to implement 2016 TNI in your lab in Fairfield. We had 50 different lab participants there. At one point, a member, right at the lunch break, he got up and he came and told me, he goes, okay, I'm leaving. And I'm like, well, why are you leaving? We're here till 3:30. What are you doing? He goes, looking at all of this, my lab's not going to do it. He goes, it's too much. I'm a one-person lab. It will just drop our certification. It's not, there's no way I can financially do it. Being an LTAC member, and I send updates out to, it's over 400 people after every LTAC meeting. He's probably about the 10th or 11th person that has responded that way to me, that their labs are not going to do this. And it kills me to think that, the immediate response back to the treatment plants, or just the customers, it's risking public health to not have that. If we could just improve the system that we have, work on the audits, and I said that was the last point, but one other little thing is that, I'm sorry, is that, we're looking at that, we know we don't want audits to fix all your problems, but the new standard has audits going to every 3 years. If we had had properly trained, qualified ELAP auditors through all this process, some of these method findings that Mitzi's group, who are properly trained and qualified, are finding, would have been found, labs would have been held accountable to correct them years and years in the past. So part of this is maybe, with part of the funding, is allowing Christine a higher budget to be able to hire qualified auditors or keep qualified auditors on staff so that we can move forward and keep them on a 2-year cycle, because decreasing the cycle of audits, I mean, that's even less than TNI is doing. TNI requires 2 years. So for ELAP to say, well, we want to be at this higher standard above TNI, but we're going to be less on that one, doesn't make sense to me either. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you. Yeah. The person that was at the meeting that left because he said that he would just drop out of the program, and then maybe the other 10 individuals, do you have any sense that under an improved program, something along the lines of what many are suggesting, a dual track program, that they would be able to maintain certification through higher standards, higher than what they have right now, in a dual track program? In other words, maybe those 10 individuals would be falling out regardless.
There's no way to prove it until we know what exactly that dual track is going to be. But I think if you relinquish a lot of the just busy work type of stuff, there's a much higher chance. I mean, you might still lose a couple, but I think you're going to lose less of them. But I can't, there's obviously no way to guarantee that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Khalid?
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, fellow board members. My name is Ray Kolish with the 29 Palms Water District. I am the general manager. I did not come up today for this particular agenda item. However, it's been a bonus to me to listen in to all the reports. The panelist reports were alarming to me from the perspective of a general manager of a water district, and it echoes the comments that board member Esquivel stated. How do we, as agencies, obtain reports for the labs that we do use to ensure that the quality of the labs that we're using is meeting our standards? These lab results obviously dictate whether sometimes we're in compliance or have to spend millions of dollars on being in compliance with regulatory issues. So again, I appreciate the question that board member Esquivel had, and I just wanted to give my perspective as general manager. I have the same question for that, so thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, that concludes public comment on this item. Questions and further comments from my colleagues? I have a few things, but I'll start with you guys if there's more. You look like you're thinking about talking, so I'm waiting.
I, like board member Diadamo, struggle, when it comes to TNI and having a dual track, or, is TNI scalable? Is it, I know it's challenging to sometimes really feel, how to best suss out, and how do we, or at least myself, approach the issue ultimately when we're asked to decide if we're going to be moving to full TNI or somehow have something less. And again, throwing the sort of premise on the inverse, the idea that you would have sort of a lesser quality standard for certain size sort of laboratories as opposed to another. Creating dual tracks, I think there are challenges in that, and how you sort of approach and justify it as well. But I know that there are real costs associated and issues of then access that come with going with just a one standard. I guess the question is if technical assistance and outreach and continued training can fill that void, or if it's not enough. And so I guess just having as much situational awareness as to what's happening with our labs, even just with the current audits on current standards, we've seen that people are dropping out because they're not able to even meet current standards. So having better and greater situational awareness as to where the problem communities are, where there may be issues of access, I think is of interest to me, certainly. And again, I struggle. I'm not sure on how best to suss it out sometimes.
Thank you. The issues that were brought up in the recent correspondence from the summit partners, to condense that, I think we need to look at the alternative. And for me to make an informed decision as a board member, I need to see more information from staff on an evaluation of what a dual track accreditation looks like. I'm concerned, especially since examples of other states have been brought forward that have adopted it. And so with the package of information in front of me, I don't feel like I have enough information to make an informed decision on TNI only versus a dual track approach. And that's where I stand at this point.
All right. That's actually not what this hearing was about, so you don't have to worry about not being ready. That's the only thing I wanted to comment on. It's an update on ELAP and some alarming findings from the audit. And I just have to say that I'll also look at all of that, talk to staff as they further develop their regulatory proceeding. I've been listening to what folks have said with an open mind, and I hear the concerns that folks have had, but I appreciate the offers of help that came from some folks, a variety of different kinds of offers of help that are truly helpful. But it's hard to not be alarmed in some ways at folks making this a referendum on TNI and about trust us versus, you can't trust them. I found that disturbing, casting aspersions on people's motives. That can work both ways very easily, and I think in this day and age, people are all too quick to do that both ways. And I think our task is to figure out how to develop a program, a lot of catch-up with integrity, and I think of, as much as I love many of you, and I love our staff, I'm up here to represent the people of the state of California who want assurance that what they're drinking is safe. And that assurance isn't trust us, we care, any more in drinking water than it is in wastewater when I used to run a wastewater facility, and our task is to figure out how to best do that. And I think that's hard. And I think people need to work together on that, and they need to have that perspective in terms of how do you create a program that has integrity versus trust us when we're coming from a big hill to climb from where we started, which is part of the reason I think in our earlier hearings why staff feels the need or wants to go to something maybe tighter than we would if we were just moving along a well-regarded program that we just need to improve a little bit. And so I think there's some challenging pieces, but I do think casting aspersion on people's motives isn't helpful in the least in terms of this proceeding. And I think it is more important that we focus on the details. And I do want to thank Ms. Webster and Ms. Teller and others who got into more of the details and the challenge of our decision and trying to figure out a better way. And I have an open mind on all of that, but I'm alarmed by the findings even 1/3 of the way through. And I think I'm just a little shocked we haven't had more focus on that in this meeting. And I'd like people to reflect on that a little bit in terms of if they're talking about their drinking water. And thank you, sir, for coming and saying you have the same questions. And that's what we're trying to figure out how to develop. So I would encourage people to stand by their words of offers to help, and it's a two-way street. And what I'm seeing in some cases is understandable advocacy, but as an advocate, I'd say it's not as helpful as bringing your whole self to the conversation, because this isn't another hearing on TNI, it was a hearing on how ELAP's doing, and there was a lot more to it than you would know from listening to most of the comments. And that's why you saw me with my jaw hanging open a little bit. I respect all of you and your sincerity and how you're looking at it, but you have to think about where you're looking at it from and on whose behalf. So sorry to give a little lecture there, but I found today a little surprising with no conclusion on what the right answer is or how challenging this is, but just speaking for one person and what would be more helpful in terms of the deliberations to come. So with that, we're done. We're going to move to the next item. Look forward, frankly, I really do look forward to further productive conversations on this as we move forward. And I want to thank all of you for all your time, both on the committee and in doing the auditing and auditing to come, and Ms. Sotelo and your team for doing all the work that you're doing to improve the program. Look forward to many more conversations. Thank you. Okay, board member reports. Who wants to start? Thank you.
So I'm going to report just on one item that I was not in attendance at our last board meeting. I chose instead to go to Region 3. They had a 2-day workshop that's sort of the kickoff on discussions of the next update of their ag order. They're calling it 4.0. And I felt that it was, I was going to be able to attend Friday, which was the day that the NGO and EJ communities were presenting, but I thought it was important to hear all parties. So that's why I chose to go, and I'm really glad I went. It's been a rough road over in Region 3 in the past, and I do think that there's a concerted effort at all levels, starting with the chair, Jean-Pierre Wolf, and Executive Director Robertson, and the board and the stakeholders. I think they're really wanting to hear all sides and really drill down on this. There have also been, on my recommendation, I was quite surprised that there weren't a lot of ag tours, which I think can be very helpful. And so there have been several ag tours, and my sense is that it was a good start. There'll be many more discussions, and hopefully I've spent some time just in the hallway talking with some of the stakeholders about our process with the East San Joaquin order, and how thrilling it was to see the AG and EJ group come together, not on all aspects, but some real key points, and tried to kind of plant the seed that that's possible in Region 3 as well.
I will just quickly report that we did adjourn Part 2 of the California Water Fix hearing yesterday. It by no means is the end of our work on the petition that is before us, but it was a major milestone to be achieved in the hearing process, and just want to take a moment and thank all the parties who participated, but more importantly, the staff. I mean, we've had several changeover of staffing during the over 2-year-long process of this hearing and continuing. And I really do appreciate from the staff operating the documents during the hearing, to those who work with the translator, to, of course, the Cal EPA webcasting folks who did an excellent job. So my hat's off to all of them for their contribution. And again, I don't know yet what will be the outcome, or whether or not there will be a reopening of the hearing, but I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the tremendous effort that staff provided into this effort, and to give Ms. Sobek and Mr. Bishop a heads up that I will now am free to focus my energy back on a lot of water quality issues.
Looking forward to it.
I would just mention that on the 20th, I was at the Water Education Foundation's Water Summit. Felicia was there as well. I participated on a panel on the human right to water. Carla Nemeth, DWR director, was on the panel as well, as were members from Tulare County, and then also EJ advocates there. So it was a good discussion, and it certainly, given that this legislative session is over now and the Clean and Safe Drinking Water Fund legislation didn't pass, there's sort of a rethinking, obviously. But what I said at that panel, what I've continued to believe in, is that we should actually, when it comes to our work here at the board, on the human right to water and continue to fulfill it, that we should assume that the fund did pass insofar as if the legislation had passed, we'd right now be talking about what a program of implementation looks like, how we were going to spend those funds, how best to then map out, what are the tools and resources and working with those communities. And I think we can still have those conversations. I think that between bond funding, between the Office of Sustainable Water Solutions, between, the various sort of pots that we kind of have out there, while, the real need for the O&M dollars obviously is not met there, we can still, though, proceed and have conversations and act as if we were about to do so, because that work has to be done either way. And the thought of sort of waiting until the next legislative session and still kind of wondering what's going to happen on that side before it is that we start really doing the formulative work around what a program would look like, I don't think we should wait. I think we should continue to push, and it'll continue to focus and maybe even help ultimately then passage of a solution in the legislature if we continue to sort of focus on what that program would look like and what we know and what tools are out there. And I think a lot of the urban water agencies as well have a lot of technical capacity, obviously, and are interested in doing some of that work and having that discussion as well. So it was a good panel, though, and that's really the only thing I was going to mention. And that tees up, I guess, you're speaking about your panel.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, please.
Yes, this month is our annual meeting of appointed regional water board and state water board members getting together in the Water Quality Coordinating Committee. And it will be on Tuesday and Wednesday, October 23rd and 24th. It'll be a day and a half. And then on the first day, well, I'll just say that the agenda has been put together by a planning committee of regional board chairs and myself and Dorina Goding, our staff person in ORPP, who's been doing a great job for years on the WQCC. And we arrive at proposed agenda items by committee, and this year we want to discuss the issue of, we're going to kick things off with discussing the issue of homelessness and impacts on water quality and what the regional and state water board roles are. We're going to move into a dimension of the human right to water, and the dimension being sanitation issues and how those issues dovetail with the human right to water and basic decent hygiene and human health. And after that, we will have an update at the 1-year anniversary of our statewide cannabis program. So we'll be hearing from program staff as well as members of other agencies that are partners in the licensing of cannabis cultivation, but the permitting process and the enforcement aspects. And that will close day 1. On day 2, we've dedicated a lot of time for the regional water boards, the members and executive staff to discuss their initiatives with respect to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And there'll be 10 to 15-minute presentations and discussions associated with each of our 9 regional water boards. And Max Gomberg, our climate specialist expert, will kick things off with a recap of our comprehensive response to climate change resolution and the initiatives we're implementing in-house at the State Water Board, as well as in committees working with the regional water board staff. And that'll take a good half of a day there, and at that point we'll wrap for the year. So encourage you all to join us wherever and whenever you can, and we'll only, there's the rule about the 2 board members at one time, I think. No, not on WQCC.
We notice it.
Okay, sorry, I get confused, sorry.
Yeah, you're thinking
Okay.
of the manager.
The manager, okay, good. So, okay, then I hope you can attend the whole time. You're fully welcome to. And actually, Board Member Esquivel will be discussing the issue of the human right to water and the sanitation issues. So look forward to that. Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about that, so that was great. I'm catching up because I left the last meeting a little bit early, and I saw the discussion about the climate summit and the water pavilion in the minutes, and I got to do that. And just a shout out, which you may or may not have made, to Debbie Franco for doing a good job at creating a pretty inspiring 2 days with an assortment of people from all over the world. Really, some of it wasn't climate necessarily, but it sure was cool. So it was I thought that was really terrific and very, very meaty, which was terrific. In the little water fix break we had before the SWR rebuttal happened, I did go out and come back out of the office to speak at a number of groups that I found inspiring for me. One was the Water Education Foundation sessions. I couldn't go to all of them, but I thought that what I was at was really good. And the panel that I was on, which was about are there consensus solutions in the Delta, was actually pretty inspiring in terms of speakers focusing on the art of the possible in terms of really doing the potential for really doing great restoration and other work on the ground as part of voluntary settlements, or just in general, and how important they are, and the importance of collaborative science. So I actually got a lot out of that, as well as the panel that Board Member Esquivel was on. I also went to the Delta Science Conference, and it was pretty fascinating to talk. I always like the Delta Science Conference, except most of the sessions I feel like I have to, like I'm in grade school compared to everybody else, because they're so complicated. But even just walking through the poster sessions and seeing all the amazing work that's being done is important. And our session was on the inevitable conversation that I'm on and have been for decades on how do you bring policymakers and scientists together to have the science and the policy somehow not dovetail, but have an interaction where the science is helpful and intelligible to policymakers, and where policymakers can also help engage with scientists on the questions they really want answered. And I always feel like it was ever thus. It actually takes a lot of work. And in this case, we were focusing a bit on the connection between the upper tribs, the Delta, and the Bay. And very interesting how the discussion around that seems to swing back and forth, from people saying, oh, we got to look at it as a whole, to folks brewing and focusing on the piece they know. And that comported with my observations over the past 30 years. So it was really pretty interesting. I don't know how useful, hopefully it was to the audience, but the panelists had a great time. Was really pretty good. And then also just a panel at the Public Policy Institute on response to climate change. And we talked a little bit about the Bay Delta, and Board Member Esquivel was there. It's just, it's always good to be there in a crowd of folks who were thinking about what it takes to actually make things happen. So it was inspiring. It was at times a little disheartening, but that's why it was real. So it was just fun to get back out there, because I hadn't spent that much time out there. I've been more burrowed in under papers, trying to reread everything I ever read on flow in my whole life in the past couple of weeks. All right, with that, we do not have a closed session today, do we? Or do we?
No. But could I report on one event?
I would love it if you would.
Partly because it was a really interesting one entire water board integrated discussion. We had a full day meeting yesterday where there were probably, I don't know, maybe 30 to 50 people, depending on and it was on the time of day and who was on the phone. But it was a lessons learned session on fire season and emergency response.
Oh, cool.
And we had representation from Division of Drinking Water, almost every region, state boards, all different parts of state boards, particularly DFA, because a lot of the regional folks and the drinking water folks, they're about boots on the ground, but how do we fund monitoring, restoration? How do we do it quickly? What pots of money are available? What kind of, how people have been learning from each other. Focusing on this year's lessons learned, obviously there were quite a lot of people from Region 5 taking a pretty significant chunk of time, but to try to contribute to the process, which we're trying to use state board resources spearheaded by ORPP to try to put resources together in a easily available SharePoint site, everything from contact
information, of staff, of interagency contacts, of memo templates, all kinds of things. And we're trying to figure out what worked, what didn't work, what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, what kind of voids there are. And we were also very privileged to have a couple of folks from Cal EPA, including Greg Vlasic, Vilsack, who's the Cal EPA Emergency Services lead, sitting through most of the day. So it was really a great effort, and we're making a lot of progress. And at some point, we'll want to, I think, bring the work of that group and the technical group that's a subset of those folks to the board for an info item.
That's great.
Just want to commend you and staff for that work. I know today's agenda item is sort of also kind of an outgrowth of that when it comes to our funding of some of the response work in Region 5. And having, chatted with staff and you previously, knowing that, the fires in Sonoma being different than the fires up in Reading insofar as, technical capacity of the other agencies involved, et cetera. And anyway, it's great work and really critical work, and work now that the Division of Drinking Water is over with us is really sort of is really the fruits of the labor of being able to integrate and cross-cut between all those divisions to really have an integrated fire response. And so I just want to again lend my support and say great work to you and staff around all that. It's been really incredible.
Cool.
Thanks for bringing that up, Director Sobek. And I do recall, and I echo Board Member Esquivel's points. And I remember when we were doing last year's WQCC, 1 week before the meeting, we changed the agenda of the WQCC to have a panel on wildfire response because of the urgent nature of it, and it was productive. And out of that discussion, I think this effort was born. There was already coordination going on, but this idea of an emergency working group, and to your point, Division of Drinking Water staff are first responders, and as new members of our family, we've really learned a lot from them over the last year. They've accomplished so much in terms of getting safe drinking water to people as soon as possible. And I just want to thank you, Director Sobek, for recognizing this was an initiative that to provide some leadership on. And congratulations getting this far. And we look forward to hearing about that in an information item.
Great. With that, go forth and have lunch.